Welcome back to Quiet Chronicles. Wherever you're listening from tonight, a dark bedroom, a car pulled over on a quiet street, a couch you've sunk into after a long day, settle in. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they've been holding on. This is the hour where the day's noise is allowed to fade, where nothing is required of you except to listen, and where sleep is welcome to arrive whenever it wants to, no matter how far into the story you get before it does. Here's a strange fact to start with. Most of the world first heard of the man we're about to spend tonight with, not through a history book, but through a map. A cartographer working on an island off the coast of Spain, decades after this man had lived, drew a tiny figure in the corner of his chart of the known world. A king seated, holding a lump of gold the size of a fist. He had never met him. He was only repeating a rumor that had traveled across a sea and a continent to reach him. And somehow, that rumor was still an understatement. If you're enjoying these evenings together, a like or a subscribe helps this channel keep finding its way to more tired minds like yours. And if you'd like to support the work more directly, there's a Patreon link waiting in the description whenever you're ready for it. Tonight we go back before that map was ever drawn, to the empire that made a man richer than record-keeping itself could handle, and the journey that let the rest of the world catch a glimpse of him. Let the history begin. Chapter 1: The Empire Before Him. Long before gold made this story famous, there was only grass, rivers, and a scattering of small kingdoms clinging to the edge of the Sahara. The land that would become Mali sat at a crossroads few people in the wider world could have pointed to on a map. Rivers cut through the region like veins, carrying trade, rumor, and ambition in equal measure. It was not yet an empire. It was a patchwork of chiefdoms, some prosperous, some barely surviving, waiting for something to bind them together. That something arrived in the form of a boy nobody expected much from. Sundiata Keita was born into the Keita clan of the Mandinka people sometime in the early 13th century, and by most accounts his childhood gave no hint of destiny. He was sickly. He could not walk properly until he was well past the age other boys were already hunting and training with weapons. Court rivals mocked him openly, certain he posed no threat to anyone's ambitions. Circumstances, however, have a way of humbling certainty. A rival kingdom, ruled by a sorcerer king named Sumanguru Kante, had already crushed the old Mandinka state and driven Sundiata's family into exile. Sundiata grew up watching his homeland ruled by another man's cruelty. He did not forget it. Somewhere in those years of exile, the sickly child began, slowly and without fanfare, to become someone else entirely. By the time Sundiata returned from exile, he had gathered allies, built a reputation, and, according to tradition, overcome the physical weakness that once defined him. The confrontation with Sumanguru came to a head around 1235 at a place remembered as Kirina. Griots, the oral historians whose job it was to preserve exactly this kind of moment, would recite this battle for centuries. Whatever the precise military details, the outcome was clear enough. Sumanguru was defeated, his old order collapsed, and Sundiata stood as the founder of something new. What Sundiata built next mattered as much as the battle that made it possible. He did not simply install himself as another local strongman ruling by force alone. Instead, according to tradition, he gathered the leaders of the clans that had fought alongside him and helped forge an agreement that would organize the new state. This gathering and the principles that came out of it would later be remembered as the Mandan Charter. The charter is not a single physical document sitting in an archive somewhere, waiting to be read under glass. It survived instead through generations of oral transmission, carried by griots whose entire profession existed to hold history in memory rather than ink. Scholars have debated exactly how much of the charter as recited today reflects the 13th century versus later editions. Even accounting for that uncertainty, the core of it describes something remarkable for its era, a framework of rights, obligations, and social order binding together the clans that had united under Sundiata. Among the principles attributed to this founding moment were protections against certain forms of violence and enslavement, arrangements for resolving disputes between the founding clans, and a broad statement of human dignity meant to apply across the new confederation. It was not a modern constitution in any strict sense, and it would be a mistake to treat it as one. But it was, by the standards of its century and region, an unusually deliberate attempt to define how people within a large, diverse political structure ought to treat one another. That ambition alone set Mali apart from many of its neighbors. Sundiata's Mali did not stay small for long. Under his rule, the new state expanded outward from its Mandinka core, absorbing territory and drawing neighboring peoples into its orbit. Some of this expansion came through further military campaigns. Some came through alliance, marriage, and the simple gravitational pull of a state that was clearly thriving, while others around it struggled. What made this expansion sustainable, rather than a brief flash of conquest followed by collapse, was geography working in Mali's favor. The empire sat astride some of the most valuable trade routes in West Africa, particularly those connecting the gold fields to the south with the salt deposits of the Sahara to the north. Salt was not a minor commodity in this era. In a world without refrigeration, salt preserved food, and entire economies organized themselves around its movement and its price. Gold moved the opposite direction along these same routes, north out of the forest regions and savannas where it was mined, destined eventually for the markets of North Africa, and from there, the wider Mediterranean world. Mali did not control the gold fields directly in every case. Much of the mining happened in tributary regions and vassal territories rather than the imperial heartland itself. What Mali controlled instead was something arguably more valuable than the mines: the routes, the markets, and the taxation that came with commanding the exchange itself. This is worth pausing on because it explains something that will matter enormously later in this story. Mali's wealth was not simply a matter of digging gold out of the ground and hoarding it. It was built on being the indispensable middleman in a trade network stretching from equatorial forests to the Mediterranean coast, taxing, regulating, and profiting from nearly every ounce of gold and every slab of salt that passed through its territory. An empire built this way accumulates wealth differently than one built purely on plunder, and it tends, when well managed, to accumulate it for a very long time. Sundiata reigned for roughly 2 decades after Karina, consolidating what he had built and establishing patterns of governance that would outlast him. He died sometime around 255, and the precise circumstances of his death remain genuinely uncertain, with different traditions offering different accounts. What is not uncertain is what he left behind: a functioning state, a set of founding principles that carried real weight among the people who governed under them, and control over trade routes that were about to become dramatically more important to the wider world than anyone in Sundiata's own lifetime could have guessed. The century that followed Sundiata's death was not a smooth, uninterrupted rise. Mali passed through several rulers, some more capable than others, and the empire's borders shifted as governors asserted or lost authority in different regions. This is the ordinary texture of empire everywhere. Expansion under a strong founder rarely translates automatically into permanent stability under his successors. Mali's institutions, though, proved sturdy enough to survive this period of adjustment without unraveling entirely. By the early 14th century, roughly 2 generations removed from Sundiata's original conquest, Mali had grown into one of the largest and wealthiest states in the region, its authority stretching across a vast swath of West Africa. Its rulers carried the title Mansa, a word carrying connotations of both king and something closer to emperor, reflecting authority over many subordinate territories and peoples rather than a single homogeneous kingdom. The office had passed through several hands since Sundiata's death, not always smoothly, and not always to universal acclaim from every corner of the empire. It was into this inheritance, a state built on trade, bound by a charter older than living memory, and sitting atop wealth that the wider world barely understood existed, that a man named Musa would eventually rise, almost by accident, to the throne. His path to power would not come through conquest or clear succession. It would come through a mystery, the disappearance of the Mansa who ruled before him, somewhere out on the waters of an ocean nobody in Mali's court had any reliable way of describing. Chapter 2: A Throne by Deputy. The Mansa who ruled Mali before Musa was a man named Abu Bakr II, and his story is one of the strangest footnotes in the empire's history. He came to power sometime in the first decade of the 14th century, inheriting a state that was stable, wealthy, and firmly in control of its trade networks. By most accounts, he governed competently enough. Yet Abu Bakr carried an obsession that would ultimately cost him his throne and possibly his life, in a manner none of his predecessors had ever attempted. That obsession was the ocean. Mali's western border ran along the Atlantic coast, and Abu Bakr became fixated on what lay beyond it. This was not idle curiosity. According to the account later recorded by the Egyptian scholar al-Umari, who gathered his information from conversations with people who had known the Malian court, Abu Bakr wanted to know whether the ocean had a far shore, and he was prepared to spend an empire's resources finding out. His first attempt was audacious by any measure. He assembled a fleet of some 200 ships, filled them with men and provisions, and sent them out into the Atlantic with instructions not to return until they reached the water's opposite edge or exhausted their supplies trying. Only one ship came back. Its captain reported that the others had been pulled into a current so strong none of them could resist it, vanishing one by one into open water, leaving him the only witness to whatever had happened to the rest. Most rulers, faced with a disaster of that scale, would have abandoned the enterprise entirely. Abu Bakr did not. If anything, the account suggests the failure only sharpened his resolve, and he began preparing a second expedition on a scale even larger than the first. This time, tradition holds. He decided not merely to fund the voyage, but to lead it himself, sailing out personally at the head of a fleet reported to number in the thousands of vessels. Before departing, Abu Bakr needed someone to govern Mali in his absence. The mechanics of medieval statecraft did not pause simply because a ruler had developed a fascination with the horizon. He needed a regent, a trusted figure capable of holding the empire together while he was gone, someone with the standing to command obedience from governors scattered across a vast and diverse territory. His choice fell on a relative of his named Musa. Very little is known with certainty about Musa's life before this moment, and what we do know comes largely through later retelling rather than contemporary record. He is generally understood to have been connected to the royal line, though the exact nature of that connection is debated among historians, with some tracing his descent through Sundiata's brother rather than through a direct father to son line from the founder himself. What matters more than the precise genealogy is the position he occupied at the moment Abu Bakr sailed away, trusted enough to be handed the entire machinery of empire, at least temporarily. Abu Bakr departed sometime around 1311 or 1312, depending on which chronology one follows, and he never returned. No ship, no survivor, no fragment of wreckage ever confirmed what became of the fleet or the Mansa who led it. The Atlantic simply closed over the story, the way it had closed over the first expedition, offering no explanation and no closure to anyone left waiting in Mali's capital. This left Musa in an unusual position. He had not seized power through conquest, and he had not been formally crowned as heir through any conventional line of succession. He held the throne because the man who was supposed to reclaim it had sailed into the ocean and vanished, leaving behind a regent with nowhere to return the crown to. Whether by design, drift, or simple necessity, the regency became a reign. Historians have long debated how to interpret this transition. Some later Arabic sources framed it more bluntly, suggesting Musa's rise involved something closer to a deliberate consolidation of power, rather than a passive inheritance of an empty seat. It is difficult, at this distance, to separate what actually happened from what later writers assumed must have happened, given how convenient the outcome was for the man left holding the throne. What can be said with more confidence is that Musa's claim, however it came about, held. That holding power was not automatic in a state the size of Mali. The empire by this point stretched across an enormous territory, encompassing dozens of distinct peoples, languages, and local traditions of governance, all nominally answering to the Mansa in the capital. A change in leadership at the top, especially one arriving through unusual circumstances rather than clear inheritance, created exactly the kind of uncertainty that ambitious regional governors tend to exploit. Musa could not simply assume loyalty. He had to earn it, region by region, in the opening years of his rule. He appears to have approached this task with more patience than aggression. Rather than launching immediate campaigns to prove his authority through force, Musa spent his early years reinforcing existing structures, confirming loyal governors in their positions, and presenting himself as a legitimate continuation of the Kita line rather than a disruption of it. This was, in its own way, a shrewder strategy than conquest would have been. An empire held together by force alone tends to fracture the moment that force weakens, while one held together by perceived legitimacy can often survive much rockier transitions. Religion played a quiet but important role in how Musa positioned himself during these early years. Islam had been present in Mali's ruling class since well before his reign, introduced gradually through trade contact with North African merchants and scholars traveling the same routes that carried gold and salt. Sundiata himself is generally understood to have remained rooted in traditional Mandinka religious practice, even as his court absorbed Islamic influence around its edges. By Musa's time, the faith had become a more central and visible part of how Mali's rulers presented themselves, both to their own subjects and to the wider Islamic world beyond their borders. Musa embraced this Islamic identity with particular seriousness, and it would come to define much of what he did with his reign. He was, by contemporary accounts, a genuinely devout man, not merely someone using religion as a convenient tool of statecraft. This distinction mattered. A ruler who saw Islam purely as useful political theater might have stopped at token gestures, but Musa's devotion pushed him toward something far more ambitious, an eventual pilgrimage to Mecca that would take years to plan and would ultimately introduce his empire to the wider world in a way nothing else could have. That pilgrimage was still years away in these early days of his reign. First, Musa had an empire to secure, an economy to understand and manage, and a court to build that reflected the scale of what he now controlled. The disappearance of Abu Bakr had handed him extraordinary power, almost by accident, but keeping that power and eventually using it to do something the world would remember required years of careful, largely unglamorous work that history tends to skip past in its rush toward the more dramatic chapters. It is worth sitting for a moment with the strangeness of how this all began. An empire that would soon become synonymous with almost unimaginable wealth came under the control of a man who inherited it, essentially, because his predecessor sailed into the Atlantic obsessed with a horizon he could not resist and never came home to answer for it. There is something almost novelistic about the sequence of events, and yet every element of it comes from the same historical tradition that would later document Musa's own far more famous journey. The ocean took one Mansa from Mali. The desert would soon carry another one out into the world, and this time everyone would be watching. Chapter 3: Consolidating the Realm. An empire is easy to inherit and hard to hold, and Musa understood this from the earliest days of his reign. The territory he now controlled did not resemble a single unified kingdom in any modern sense. It was closer to a federation of provinces, tributary states, and semi-autonomous regions, each bound to the Mansa in the capital through a mixture of loyalty, obligation, and calculated self-interest. Holding that structure together required something more delicate than simply issuing commands and expecting them obeyed. Mali's geography alone made this task formidable. The empire by Musa's time stretched from the Atlantic coast in the west across a vast interior, reaching toward the fringes of the Sahara in the north and touching the edges of the forest regions in the south. Distances between the capital and the empire's furthest territories could take weeks to cross even under favorable conditions. A governor stationed far from the center could, in practice, operate with a degree of independence that no ruler sitting comfortably in the capital could fully monitor. Musa's response to this challenge was not to centralize power aggressively, which would have required resources and manpower the empire could not easily spare. Instead, he leaned on a system already partially in place: provincial governors, often drawn from local ruling families or trusted military commanders, who administered their regions on the Mansa's behalf in exchange for a share of local revenue and a measure of autonomy. This arrangement had obvious risks. It also happened to be the only realistic way to govern territory this large, with the administrative tools available in the 14th century. Loyalty in this system was rarely absolute or permanent. Governors who felt slighted, underpaid, or overlooked had both the means and the incentive to quietly reduce their cooperation with the capital, withholding tribute or simply governing as though the Mansa's authority applied a little less strictly to them than to their neighbors. Musa could not police every province personally, and he knew it. What he could do was make the arrangement worthwhile enough and his own authority visible enough that defection remained the less attractive option. Part of how he accomplished this involved careful, ongoing attention to who held which position and why. Rather than treating governorships as fixed inheritances passed automatically within local families, Musa appears to have used appointments and confirmations as tools of political management, rewarding loyalty and quietly sidelining figures whose commitment seemed uncertain. This was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that rarely makes it into dramatic retellings of a reign. It was also precisely the kind of work that determined whether an empire like Mali held together or began fraying at its edges within a generation. Trade routes running through the empire added another layer of complexity to this balancing act. Mali's wealth depended almost entirely on controlling the movement of gold, salt, and other goods passing through its territory on the way to markets further north and east. Every province the trade routes crossed represented both an opportunity for revenue and a potential point of failure, since a governor willing to skim more than his share, or a local conflict disrupting caravan traffic, could damage the empire's finances far more severely than a purely agricultural disruption might have. Musa's court therefore paid close attention to the provinces sitting directly along these commercial arteries, often treating their governance as a higher priority than more remote agricultural regions, contributing less directly to imperial revenue. This was not favoritism in any petty sense. It reflected a clear-eyed understanding of where the empire's real leverage actually lived, and a determination to protect it above almost everything else. An empire that lost control of its trade routes would eventually lose the wealth that made its other ambitions possible. Military force remained part of this picture, though Musa appears to have relied on it more as a deterrent than a first resort. Mali maintained standing forces capable of responding to unrest or rebellion within its provinces, and the mere existence of that capability likely discouraged some governors from testing the limits of their independence too openly. There is little evidence, however, of Musa launching frequent punitive campaigns against his own territories during these early years. A ruler who spends his reign constantly suppressing internal revolt rarely has the stability required to attempt anything as ambitious as what Musa would eventually undertake. Religion functioned as another quiet thread running through this consolidation effort. Islam, already established within Mali's ruling class before Musa's rise, offered a shared framework of legitimacy that could bridge some of the cultural and ethnic diversity spread across the empire's provinces. A shared faith, or at least a shared elite religious identity among governing figures, provided one more layer of connective tissue holding together a territory that otherwise had little linguistic or cultural uniformity binding it from end to end. This is not to suggest religious conversion was uniform or complete across Mali's population during Musa's reign. Traditional Mandinka religious practice remained deeply present among ordinary people throughout the empire, and Islam functioned primarily as an elite and urban phenomenon concentrated among rulers, merchants, and scholars rather than a faith imposed uniformly on every subject. Musa understood this distinction well enough not to force the issue. He promoted Islamic identity at the level of governance and diplomacy, while leaving local religious practice largely undisturbed at the village level. Court life during these consolidation years reflected an empire growing more sophisticated in how it presented itself, both internally and to outside observers. Musa's capital likely centered around the city of Niani, though its exact location remains a subject of ongoing archaeological debate, functioned as the administrative heart from which governors received instructions and to which tribute flowed. Visitors from North Africa and the broader Islamic world who passed through Mali during this period described a court marked by ceremony, hierarchy, and a level of organization that surprised many who had assumed, wrongly, that a state this far south of the Mediterranean would be comparatively unsophisticated. Diplomatic contact with neighboring and distant powers grew during these years as well, laying groundwork that would matter enormously once Musa's later pilgrimage put Mali firmly on the map of the wider Islamic world. Merchants traveling the trans-Saharan routes carried not just goods but information, and Mali's growing reputation for wealth and stability under Musa's rule likely traveled north well before Musa himself ever did. This slow accumulation of reputation would prove valuable later, easing the path for the kind of reception Musa would eventually receive in cities like Cairo. None of this consolidation happened quickly or without setbacks. Some provinces likely tested Musa's authority more than others during these early years, though the historical record preserves few specific details of individual conflicts or negotiations from this period. What survives instead is the broader pattern, an empire that entered Musa's reign through unusual and uncertain circumstances, and that emerged from his first years on the throne noticeably more stable, more centralized in its economic administration, and more capable of projecting authority across its full territorial extent than it had been at the moment Abu Bakr sailed away. By the time Musa turned his attention toward the idea of pilgrimage, the empire beneath him was ready to support an undertaking of enormous scale. A less secure ruler, still fighting to establish authority over restless provinces, could never have safely left his capital for the length of time a journey to Mecca would require. Musa's willingness to eventually commit years to a pilgrimage across an entire continent reflects, in part, just how thoroughly he had secured his position at home before he ever considered leaving it. This security did not happen by accident, and it did not happen quickly. It came from years of careful appointments, protected trade routes, restrained but credible military capacity, and a religious identity carefully calibrated to unite an elite class without disrupting the wider population beneath it. The empire Musa would eventually carry with him, in reputation if not in person, onto the world stage was built first in these quieter years, province by province, governor by governor, long before a single camel was loaded for the journey north. Chapter 4: The Gold Beneath Everything. To understand what made Mali different from other wealthy states of its era, you have to understand where its gold actually came from, and just as importantly, where it did not. The empire itself controlled almost none of the mines that produced the metal underpinning its entire economy. This sounds like a contradiction until you look closer at how the system actually worked, and once you do, it becomes one of the more elegant arrangements in medieval economic history. The gold came primarily from two regions lying at the empire's southern edges: Bambouk, nestled between the Senegal and Falamé rivers, and Bouré, further east along tributaries of the Niger. Both areas sat at the boundary between Mali's core territory and the forest zones further south, in lands populated by peoples who were not always directly governed by the Mansa's administration. Mining itself was often carried out by local communities using techniques passed down across generations, extracting gold from riverbeds and shallow surface deposits rather than deep excavation. Here is the detail that surprised so many outside observers once word of Mali's wealth eventually spread. The rulers of Mali, by long-standing custom, did not claim ownership over gold nuggets found by miners in these regions. Nuggets belonged to whoever found them, and this rule was apparently enforced strictly enough that it became a defining feature of how outsiders described the region's economy for generations. What the Mansa claimed instead was gold dust, and the distinction mattered enormously in practice. Gold dust, unlike nuggets, moved through the economy constantly, changing hands in every transaction from local markets to long-distance trade. By claiming rights over dust while leaving nuggets to individual finders, Mali's rulers positioned themselves to profit from the circulation of wealth rather than its initial extraction. This was, in effect, a tax on commerce itself rather than a tax on labor, and it meant the crown's fortunes rose and fell with the health of trade across the entire empire rather than with the luck of any particular mining season. This structure created something economists centuries later would recognize as a genuinely sophisticated system, even though nobody in 14th century Mali would have used that language to describe it. Miners had every incentive to keep working, since they retained ownership over the nuggets that represented the most valuable individual finds. The crown, meanwhile, drew steady revenue from the broader flow of trade, insulated somewhat from the unpredictability of any single mine's output. Both sides of the arrangement had reason to keep the system functioning smoothly. Secrecy played an equally important role in how this wealth was managed and protected. Arab and Berber traders who came south to purchase gold were, by most accounts, never permitted to travel directly to the mining regions themselves. Instead, exchanges happened through a system sometimes described as silent trade, in which goods were left at designated locations. Gold was placed alongside them by parties who never directly met, and both sides withdrew to allow the exchange to complete without face to face negotiation. Whether this particular practice was literally silent in every instance, or whether later writers exaggerated its mystique somewhat, the broader point holds regardless. Mali's rulers went to considerable lengths to prevent foreign traders from learning exactly where the gold originated or how much of it existed in total. This secrecy served a clear economic purpose. A trading partner who does not know your true supply and cannot verify it independently has far less leverage to negotiate favorable prices than one who does. The result of this careful management was an empire whose wealth remained, for outsiders, more rumor than verified fact for generations. North African traders knew Mali produced enormous quantities of gold because the metal itself kept arriving, flowing north along established caravan routes toward markets in Fez, Tunis, and eventually across the Mediterranean into Europe. What those traders did not know and could not easily find out was the actual scale of production happening at the source, or how the system that generated it truly functioned. This gap between rumor and verified knowledge would matter enormously once Musa eventually traveled north himself. Until his pilgrimage, most of what the wider Islamic world understood about Mali's wealth came filtered through several layers of intermediaries, each of whom had reason to either exaggerate or downplay what they actually knew. Traders sometimes had incentive to inflate Mali's reputation to justify their own profits from handling its gold, while at other times the secrecy surrounding the trade left outsiders simply guessing at numbers with no reliable way to check them. Salt moved in the opposite direction along these same routes, and its role in this economy deserves equal attention rather than a passing mention. Salt deposits in the Sahara, particularly around the mining center of Tagaza, produce slabs of nearly pure salt that were transported south by camel caravan into regions where the mineral was scarce and desperately needed. In an era without refrigeration, salt was not a luxury seasoning, but a genuine necessity for preserving food and sustaining populations through seasons when fresh provisions were unavailable. The exchange rate between gold and salt across these trade routes reflected just how differently the two commodities were valued depending on which end of the route you stood at. In regions abundant with gold but scarce in salt, a slab of salt could command a price in gold that would have seemed almost absurd from the perspective of a North African trader for whom salt was comparatively common and gold was the rare, precious commodity worth chasing. This asymmetry in relative value was precisely what made the entire trans-Saharan trading system so profitable for everyone positioned correctly within it. Mali's genius, if that word applies to an economic system built up gradually rather than designed by any single mind, lay in positioning itself as the essential intermediary controlling this exchange in both directions. The empire did not need to mine every ounce of gold or produce every slab of salt moving through its territory. It needed only to control the routes, tax the transactions, and maintain enough political stability that traders on both ends of the exchange continued to trust the system enough to keep using it. This is a fundamentally different model of wealth than the one Europe was building during roughly the same period, and the distinction is worth sitting with for a moment. European wealth in this era tended to concentrate around land ownership, feudal obligation, and the direct extraction of agricultural surplus from a bound peasantry. Mali's wealth instead flowed from commerce, taxation of trade, and a deliberately cultivated position as an indispensable middleman between two resources that neither side of the exchange could easily produce for itself. The consequences of this structural difference would become starkly visible once Musa carried a portion of this accumulated wealth north on his pilgrimage. Cities accustomed to gold arriving gradually, in modest quantities carried by ordinary trade caravans, had never encountered a single individual moving with the kind of concentrated wealth an entire trading system could generate when its profits accumulated for decades under a stable and wealthy court. What looked, from inside Mali, like the ordinary fruits of a well managed economy would look, from outside, like something closer to a natural disaster in reverse, a flood of gold arriving all at once rather than trickling in over years. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened quickly. It took generations of careful management, secrecy maintained across countless individual transactions, and a legal structure distinguishing nuggets from dust in a way that balanced the interests of miners against the interests of the crown to produce the kind of accumulated wealth that Musa would eventually inherit and in time spend in a manner the wider world had genuinely never witnessed before. Understanding this foundation makes what happens next considerably easier to grasp, because the pilgrimage that follows was never simply one man's personal journey. It was an entire economic system, built patiently over a century, finally stepping out from behind its own secrecy and into the full light of the wider world's attention. Chapter 5. A Vow is Made. Somewhere in the years following the consolidation of his empire, Musa began seriously entertaining an idea that had been present in Mali's court for generations but never fully realized on the scale he envisioned. The Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca required of Muslims capable of undertaking it, was not a new concept to Mali's ruling class. Earlier Mansas had made the journey before him, some successfully, though none had done so in a way that left much lasting impression on the wider Islamic world. Musa's decision to attempt it himself would prove to be a very different matter entirely. Understanding why Musa took this decision as seriously as he did requires looking past the simple fact of his religious devotion, real as that devotion appears to have been. Islam by his era had become deeply woven into how Mali's court understood its own legitimacy, both internally among its elite and externally in its dealings with the wider Muslim world stretching from Egypt to Morocco. A Mansa who completed the Hajj was not merely fulfilling a personal religious obligation. He was making a statement about Mali's place within a much larger civilization, one that spanned continents and centered its spiritual geography on cities Musa had likely never seen with his own eyes. Contemporary accounts consistently describe Musa as a man of genuine piety, not someone treating religion as mere political theater layered over more practical ambitions. This distinction carried real weight in how historians have since interpreted his motivations. A ruler motivated purely by political calculation might have sent representatives to complete symbolic religious duties on his behalf, a common enough practice among monarchs unwilling to risk extended absence from their thrones. Musa instead chose to go himself, in person, undertaking a journey that would keep him away from his empire for well over a year. The risks inherent in this decision should not be understated. Leaving Mali for such an extended period meant leaving the empire's day-to-day governance in the hands of others, exposing the state to exactly the kind of instability that had claimed Musa's own predecessor when Abu Bakr sailed away and never returned. Musa was old enough by this point in his reign and secure enough in the loyalty of his governors that he judged the risk manageable. Still, the decision reflects a level of confidence in his own consolidated authority that few rulers in his position could have justified taking. Religious obligation alone does not fully explain the scale Musa chose for this undertaking, however. Simply fulfilling the Hajj required nothing more than personal presence at the appropriate rites in Mecca, performed with whatever modest retinue a pilgrim could reasonably assemble. What Musa planned instead was something closer to a royal procession stretched across an entire continent, involving tens of thousands of people and a portion of his kingdom's accumulated wealth carried physically across the Sahara. This was pilgrimage transformed into diplomacy, religious duty fused with a deliberate announcement of Mali's existence to a world that barely knew the empire was there. Islam's presence within Mali's court by this period deserves a closer look, since it explains why a pilgrimage of this magnitude felt not just possible, but almost natural to attempt. The faith had entered West Africa gradually over preceding centuries, carried south along trade routes by merchants and scholars traveling between North Africa and the gold fields feeding the trans-Saharan economy. Trade and religion moved together along these same paths, each reinforcing the other, since shared faith between trading partners tended to ease the trust required for large commercial transactions conducted across enormous distances. By the time of Sundiata's founding of the empire in the 13th century, Islam already had a foothold among West African merchant communities, even if the general population remained largely rooted in older traditional practices. Sundiata himself is generally believed to have kept much of his personal religious identity within traditional Mandinka practice, even as elements of Islamic influence gathered around the edges of his court. Each Mansa who followed him inherited a court somewhat further along this gradual process of Islamic integration than the one before, a slow accumulation of religious identity building across generations, rather than arriving through any single dramatic conversion. Musa inherited this trajectory and pushed it further than any of his predecessors had managed. Scholars, jurists, and religious teachers had become increasingly visible fixtures within Mali's court by his reign, lending the state an intellectual and spiritual character that distinguished it from purely martial or purely commercial kingdoms elsewhere in the region. This context matters for understanding Musa's eventual pilgrimage, because it was not an isolated gesture emerging from nowhere. It was the natural culmination of decades of gradual religious deepening within the very institution Musa now led. There is also a diplomatic dimension worth considering carefully, one that likely occurred to Musa even if it was never stated explicitly in whatever internal deliberations led to his decision. A pilgrimage on the scale he was planning would carry him through Cairo, then one of the great cities of the Islamic world, ruled by a sultan whose court maintained relationships with rulers across North Africa and the wider Mediterranean. Passing through such a city with an impressive retinue offered an opportunity that a smaller, quieter pilgrimage never could have provided, the chance to be seen, taken seriously, and remembered by exactly the kind of powerful audience capable of spreading word of Mali far beyond anything trade rumors alone had managed to achieve. Whether Musa consciously planned for this diplomatic outcome, or whether it emerged as a fortunate byproduct of a journey undertaken primarily for religious reasons, remains genuinely unclear from the surviving sources. Al-Umari's later account, gathered from Cairenes who remembered Musa's visit, focuses heavily on the spectacle of his wealth and generosity rather than any explicit statements of diplomatic intent Musa himself might have made. What can be said with confidence is that Musa understood, at minimum, that traveling with such a retinue would inevitably draw attention, and he chose to travel that way regardless of whether attention was the primary goal or simply an accepted consequence. Financing an undertaking of this scale required drawing directly on the wealth accumulated through Mali's careful management of its gold and salt trade over preceding decades. This was not a modest withdrawal from a royal treasury. Contemporary and later accounts describe quantities of gold set aside for the journey that, even allowing for exaggeration common in oral and written traditions of this era, represented an extraordinary portion of the empire's accumulated wealth. Musa was, in effect, preparing to carry a meaningful fraction of Mali's entire economic history north across the desert, to be spent, given away, and displayed in cities that had never seen anything remotely like it. Preparing for a journey of this magnitude took years rather than months. Provisions needed gathering on a scale sufficient to sustain tens of thousands of travelers across some of the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. Animals needed acquiring and training for the specific demands of a trans-Saharan crossing. Officials needed appointing to manage logistics that had no real precedent in Mali's prior history, since no previous Mansa had ever attempted a pilgrimage remotely this large. Musa also needed to settle the question of who would govern Mali during his absence, a decision carrying obvious weight given how his own rise to power had come about through exactly this kind of situation. Historical sources indicate he left his son, generally identified as Mahan, to serve as regent while he was away, a choice reflecting both dynastic continuity and, perhaps, a lesson learned from the uncertainty that followed Abu Bakr's own departure decades earlier. Musa, unlike his predecessor, had every intention of returning, and he structured the regency accordingly, as a temporary arrangement rather than an accidental permanent transfer of power. By the time preparations neared completion, word of the coming pilgrimage had likely already begun traveling north along established trade routes, carried by merchants who had witnessed the scale of what Mali's court was assembling. This meant that by the time Musa's caravan actually departed, At least some portion of the wider trading world already anticipated that something unusual was coming, even if nobody yet grasped quite how unusual it would turn out to be. The vow Musa had made to himself and to his faith was about to become the empire's vow as well, carried forward by tens of thousands of people about to cross a desert most of them had never seen. What awaited them on that crossing would test every aspect of the planning that had gone into these preparatory years, from the provisioning calculations to the choice of route to the relationships Mali's court had cultivated with the desert peoples who alone knew how to survive the journey safely. The devotion driving Musa forward was genuine, and so was the political opportunity riding alongside it. Neither motive canceled out the other. Together, they were about to carry an empire's wealth and an empire's reputation across the harshest geography in the region and directly into the historical record of the wider world. Chapter 6: Assembling the Caravan. Turning a vow into an actual departure required solving logistical problems that no previous ruler in Mali's history had ever faced at this scale. The numbers alone, even accounting for likely exaggeration in the surviving accounts, describe something closer to a moving city than a traditional pilgrimage retinue. Estimates from various sources place the total number of people traveling with Musa somewhere between 8,000 and 60,000, a range wide enough to reflect just how difficult it was for contemporary observers to actually count a group this large as it moved through unfamiliar territory. Whatever the precise figure, everyone who has studied the available sources agrees on one thing. This was unlike anything the trans-Saharan trade routes had carried before. A caravan this size did not simply walk out of Mali's capital one morning and head north. It required months, likely years, of advanced planning, covering everything from food provisions to water access to the diplomatic arrangements needed to move safely through territories controlled by peoples who were not always under Mali's direct authority. Feeding a group of this size across a journey lasting many months presented perhaps the single greatest logistical challenge of the entire undertaking. Grain, dried meat, and other provisions needed to be gathered in quantities almost impossible to imagine for a single expedition, then transported alongside the travelers themselves, rather than purchased along the route, since much of the journey passed through desert regions where local supplies simply could not support a group this large. Pack animals carried the bulk of this burden, and camels in particular became essential once the caravan reached the harsher stretches of Saharan terrain where horses could not reliably survive. The camels themselves numbered in the thousands, acquired and trained specifically for the demands of desert travel in a way that reflected careful, deliberate preparation rather than improvisation. Camels could carry heavier loads across greater distances without water than any other pack animal available to Mali's planners, and their endurance made the difference between a caravan that could realistically cross the Sahara and one that would simply perish partway through the attempt. Musa's court had clearly studied what previous, smaller trading caravans had learned about desert crossing over generations, applying those lessons at a scale nobody had previously attempted. Gold formed the other essential cargo, and here the accounts grow genuinely difficult to fully credit, though the broader picture they paint is consistent enough to trust in its general shape. Al-Umari's later account describes camels loaded with gold in quantities that, if taken literally, would represent an almost unimaginable transfer of wealth moving across the desert at once. Whatever the precise tonnage actually was, Musa clearly intended to travel not just as a pilgrim fulfilling a religious obligation, but as a sovereign capable of matching and eventually exceeding the wealth and generosity of any court he might encounter along the way. The human composition of the caravan extended well beyond soldiers and officials accompanying the Mansa on his journey. Historical accounts describe large numbers of enslaved people traveling as part of the retinue, a detail that reflects the uncomfortable reality that slavery was deeply embedded in the economic and social structures of medieval Mali, as it was across much of the world during this era. Some sources suggest thousands of enslaved attendants traveled with the caravan, performing labor essential to sustaining a group this large across such an extended journey. This detail deserves acknowledgement rather than avoidance, since it forms a genuine part of the historical record rather than a footnote that can be quietly set aside. Slavery in Mali, as in many medieval societies across Africa, Europe, and Asia, existed within social and economic systems that do not map cleanly onto later, more familiar forms of chattel slavery that would develop across the Atlantic world centuries afterward. This distinction does not diminish the reality of what enslavement meant for the people living through it. It simply means the specific historical context differed from other, better known systems that emerged later. Beyond the enslaved attendants, the caravan included wives, court officials, religious scholars, musicians, and soldiers, each group serving distinct functions within an undertaking that combined religious pilgrimage with royal display. Musa's wife, generally identified in surviving accounts as accompanying him on the journey, traveled with her own substantial retinue, reflecting the fact that this was not a stripped down expedition traveling light, but rather an entire royal court relocating temporarily in full ceremonial form across an entire continent. Musicians held a particular significance within this arrangement that modern audiences might not immediately appreciate. Griots, the hereditary oral historians and performers central to West African court culture, traveled as part of the retinue, providing music, storytelling, and praise poetry that accompanied the caravan's movement and reinforced Musa's status at every stop along the route. Their presence signaled that this journey carried cultural weight extending well beyond its religious purpose, functioning simultaneously as a traveling demonstration of Mali's courtly sophistication. Soldiers accompanied the group primarily for protection, since a caravan carrying this much visible wealth represented an obvious and tempting target for anyone along the route inclined toward banditry. The desert crossing in particular exposed the group to territories controlled by various Tuareg and other Saharan peoples, whose cooperation or hostility could make an enormous difference in how safely the caravan actually completed its journey. Diplomatic arrangements, likely negotiated well in advance through existing trade relationships, probably smoothed passage through much of this territory more effectively than military force alone could have managed. Water access shaped the entire planned route in ways that left Musa's caravan with far less flexibility than the sheer scale of the expedition might suggest. Wells and oases scattered across the Sahara were not evenly distributed, and a group numbering in the thousands or tens of thousands could not simply travel in a straight line toward its destination without careful attention to where reliable water sources actually existed. The route north almost certainly followed established trading paths, precisely because those paths had already been tested and refined by generations of smaller caravans searching out exactly this kind of information. Timing the departure also mattered enormously, since the punishing heat of the Sahara's peak season could turn an already dangerous crossing into a genuinely lethal one for a group this size. Caravans traditionally timed their departures to avoid the worst extremes of desert heat wherever possible, and there is little reason to think Musa's planners would have ignored this basic, hard won wisdom simply because their expedition was larger than anything attempted before. Every logistical decision, from timing to route to provisioning, reflected lessons accumulated across centuries of trans Saharan trade rather than improvisation invented specifically for this journey. The scale of preparation required for departure meant that by the time the caravan actually set out, word of what was coming had almost certainly already begun spreading along trade networks, extending well ahead of the travelers themselves. Merchants moving north with smaller, ordinary caravans would have passed through towns and trading posts, describing what they had seen forming behind them in Mali, planting early seeds of anticipation in cities the caravan had not yet even approached. By the time Musa's procession actually reached the edges of the desert, some portion of the wider world was already listening for news of its approach. What finally set out from Mali's heartland was, by any reasonable estimate, one of the largest single expeditions the trans-Saharan trade routes had ever carried. Thousands of camels, tens of thousands of people, and an amount of gold that would soon reshape economies far beyond anything Mali's own borders contained, all moving together across some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. The empire that had spent generations quietly perfecting the art of trade, secrecy, and accumulated wealth was, for the first time, about to carry that wealth openly into the full view of the world it had traded with indirectly for so long. Chapter 7: Crossing the Sahara. Nothing in the preparation could fully soften what the Sahara actually demanded of everyone who entered it. The desert did not care how many camels a caravan brought, or how carefully its planners had calculated water needs. It simply presented the same brutal conditions to every traveler who crossed it, whether they came as a small trading party of a dozen merchants or an imperial procession numbering in the tens of thousands, and it punished miscalculation without exception or mercy. Heat during daylight hours reached extremes that could be genuinely dangerous even for people who had spent their entire lives adapting to hot climates further south. Temperatures could climb past what the human body could safely endure for extended periods, and this reality shaped nearly every decision about when and how the caravan moved. Travel often concentrated around cooler hours, early morning and evening, with the harshest midday heat reserved for rest whenever terrain and water access allowed the group that flexibility. Nights brought their own contradiction, one that surprised travelers unfamiliar with desert extremes. Temperatures could fall dramatically after sunset, sometimes dropping close to freezing in certain seasons and regions, a shift so severe it caught people off guard even when they had been warned in advance. A caravan the size of Musa's needed provisions and shelter, capable of handling both extremes within the same 24-hour cycle, a logistical demand that added yet another layer of complexity to an already staggering undertaking. Water remained the single most decisive factor determining survival across the entire crossing. Wells and oases were scattered unevenly across the route, some reliable and well maintained through generations of use by trading caravans, others seasonal or prone to running dry unpredictably depending on rainfall patterns nobody could fully anticipate in advance. Musa's caravan almost certainly relied on guides possessing detailed, hard won knowledge of exactly where water could be found, since a miscalculation here could prove fatal to thousands of people within days rather than weeks. This is where the Tuareg and other Saharan peoples became essential to the entire undertaking in ways that pure numbers and gold could never substitute for. These desert communities had spent countless generations mastering the specific skills required to survive and navigate this terrain, developing knowledge of hidden water sources, safe paths through shifting sand formations, and the subtle environmental signs that separated a survivable crossing from a catastrophic one. Mali's relationship with these groups, built through generations of prior trans Saharan trade, likely provided access to guides and intermediaries whose expertise made Musa's massive undertaking survivable in the first place. Relations with these desert peoples were not always straightforward, however, and required careful diplomatic handling alongside the practical logistics of guidance and provisioning. Some Saharan groups operated with a degree of independence from any centralized authority, including Mali's own, and safe passage through their territories often depended on negotiated arrangements rather than simple assumption of goodwill. Tribute, gifts, or established trading relationships likely smoothed much of this passage, though the historical record offers frustratingly few specific details about exactly how these negotiations unfolded during Musa's particular crossing. Oases along the route functioned as more than simple water stops during this journey. They served as gathering points where the caravan could rest, resupply, and make contact with the wider trading world that used these same paths regularly for smaller, more conventional commercial expeditions. Merchants passing through these oases in the opposite direction would have carried word of Musa's approaching caravan onward, spreading anticipation ahead of the group faster than the caravan itself could physically travel. To Gaza, the salt mining settlement sitting along one of the primary routes north likely represented one of the more significant waypoints during this crossing, given its established role as a hub connecting Saharan salt production with the broader trans-Saharan trade network. A settlement built almost entirely around the extraction and movement of salt, with buildings reportedly constructed from salt blocks in a region where conventional building materials were scarce, would have offered Musa's caravan both a practical resupply point and a vivid illustration of just how thoroughly this desert economy organized itself around commodities that seemed almost absurd from a settled agricultural perspective. The sheer scale of Musa's caravan created challenges that smaller trading expeditions never had to solve. Grazing and water sufficient for a handful of merchants and their animals simply did not scale linearly to a group numbering in the thousands or tens of thousands, meaning the caravan likely had to spread itself across a wider physical area than conventional trading parties, moving in sections rather than as a single dense column, to avoid exhausting any single water source or grazing area beyond its capacity to recover. This logistical spreading created its own risks, since a caravan stretched out across greater distances became harder to protect and coordinate than a tightly clustered group. Communication between different sections of such an enormous procession would have relied on riders moving back and forth along the column, relaying information about pace, hazards, and upcoming stops. The complexity involved in simply keeping a group this size moving together in roughly the same direction at a sustainable pace represented a management challenge on a scale few rulers anywhere in the medieval world had ever attempted to solve. Illness and exhaustion inevitably took some toll across a journey lasting many months and covering enormous distances under such punishing conditions, though specific casualty figures from Musa's crossing do not survive in any detail worth repeating with confidence. What can be said generally is that desert crossings of this era carried genuine mortality risk for any travelers attempting them, and a caravan this size, despite its careful planning and considerable resources, would not have been immune to the ordinary dangers that claimed lives on smaller trading expeditions using these same routes. Somewhere along this journey, the caravan crossed from territory where Mali's influence and reputation carried real weight into regions where the empire was known, if at all, only through second-hand trading rumors rather than direct political contact. This transition mattered enormously for what followed. Musa was moving from a context where his authority was locally understood and respected into one where he would need to establish his standing essentially from scratch, relying on the spectacle of his caravan itself to communicate a wealth and power that words alone could never adequately convey to strangers. By the time the caravan approached the northern edges of the Sahara, nearing territories under more direct contact with the broader Islamic Mediterranean world, word of its scale had almost certainly raced ahead through the same trading networks that had carried rumors of Mali's wealth for generations already. Merchants, officials, and ordinary residents of towns along the approaching route would have heard, in increasingly vivid and probably increasingly exaggerated detail, about the enormous procession making its way north, carrying more gold than most of them could readily imagine, led by a king whose name few of them had heard clearly pronounced before. The desert crossing had tested every aspect of the preparation that went into this journey, from the choice of pack animals to the diplomatic relationships cultivated with Saharan peoples to the sheer physical endurance of everyone involved. It had also accomplished something the planners back in Mali could not have fully anticipated in advance. It had turned rumor into anticipation, transforming Musa from an abstract name attached to distant stories about gold into a figure whose actual physical approach was now being tracked and discussed by the very cities he was about to enter. What waited for him in Cairo would prove to be unlike anything even this carefully planned journey had fully prepared him for. Chapter 8: Cairo and the Gold Crash. Cairo in 1324 was one of the great cities of the medieval world, a center of learning, trade, and political power under the rule of the Mamluk Sultanate. Its markets drew merchants from across the Mediterranean and beyond, and its scholars corresponded with intellectual centers stretching from Baghdad to Andalusia. This was not a provincial town likely to be easily impressed by visiting royalty. Cairo had seen wealthy travelers before, Kings and princes from various corners of the Islamic world passing through on their own pilgrimages toward Mecca. Musa's arrival changed the calculus of what impressive actually meant. By the time his caravan reached the outskirts of the city, word of its scale had already circulated widely enough that a considerable crowd had gathered simply to witness the spectacle firsthand. What they saw exceeded even the most inflated rumors that had traveled ahead of the procession. Thousands upon thousands of people moved through the streets, camels laden with goods, officials in elaborate dress, and at the center of it all, a king whose wealth seemed to defy ordinary comprehension. The ruling authority in Cairo at this time was Al-Malik al-Nasir Muhammad, the Mamluk Sultan, a sophisticated and experienced ruler who had held power through multiple periods on the throne and understood better than most how to manage relationships with visiting dignitaries. Protocol required that Musa, as a visiting monarch, pay his respects to the Sultan, though the exact nature of this meeting reveals something interesting about how Musa understood his own status relative to the rulers he encountered along his journey. He was not eager to simply prostrate himself before another sovereign, even one as powerful as al Nasir. According to accounts gathered later by al-Umari, Musa initially resisted the customary practice of kissing the ground before the Sultan, a gesture expected of visitors regardless of their own rank back home. This hesitation reflected genuine pride rather than simple ignorance of local custom. Musa eventually relented, reportedly reframing the gesture as an act of submission before God rather than before the Sultan personally, a clever bit of face-saving diplomacy that allowed him to satisfy protocol without appearing to diminish his own royal dignity in the process. This small negotiation over ceremony set the tone for how Musa would conduct himself throughout his time in Cairo. He was clearly a man who understood his own significance and was not inclined to behave as though he were a supplicant arriving to beg favor from a greater power. At the same time, he showed enough diplomatic flexibility to avoid unnecessary friction with a sultan whose goodwill would matter considerably for the remainder of his journey through Mamluk territory. This balance between pride and pragmatism appears throughout the various accounts of his stay. What truly distinguished Musa's visit, however, was not diplomatic maneuvering, but sheer, almost incomprehensible generosity with gold. Accounts describe him giving away gold constantly throughout his stay, to officials, to religious scholars, to ordinary residents who crossed his path, and to anyone connected with hosting or assisting his enormous retinue during their time in the city. This was not calculated charity dispensed sparingly for maximum diplomatic effect. It was closer to an open tap, gold flowing outward in quantities that seemed to increase rather than diminish the longer his stay continued. The economic consequences of this generosity became apparent with a speed that surprised even Musa's own advisors, if later accounts are to be believed. Gold as a commodity derives its value partly from scarcity, and Cairo's markets operated according to the same basic principles of supply and demand that governed commerce anywhere else in the medieval world. When an enormous quantity of gold suddenly flooded into circulation within a relatively short period, the value of gold relative to other goods and currencies began to fall, a straightforward economic consequence that nonetheless caught Cairo's merchants and financial officials off guard. Prices for goods purchased with gold rose accordingly, since more gold was now required to buy the same quantities of grain, cloth, or other everyday commodities than had been necessary before Musa's arrival. This inflation rippled outward through Cairo's economy during his stay, affecting merchants, moneylenders, and ordinary residents whose livelihoods depended on stable currency values. What began as an impressive display of royal generosity had, within weeks, become a genuine economic disruption, affecting one of the largest cities in the medieval world. Alomari's account, compiled roughly a decade after Musa's visit from interviews with Cairenes who remembered the disruption firsthand, describes the gold market's devaluation in terms that suggest lasting impact rather than a brief, easily absorbed fluctuation. Some later sources suggest the effects of this sudden gold influx persisted for years afterward, though the exact duration and severity remain difficult to verify with precision given the limitations of medieval economic record keeping. What is not disputed is that Musa's visit represented one of the most dramatic single injections of precious metal into a major medieval economy that contemporary observers had ever witnessed or recorded. This economic disruption reveals something important about the fundamental mismatch between how Musa understood wealth and how Cairo's more commercially sophisticated economy actually functioned. In Mali, gold flowed through an economy that had developed specific mechanisms, including the crown's careful distinction between nuggets and dust, precisely to manage its circulation without destabilizing value. Musa, arriving in a foreign economic system with different mechanisms and different sensitivities to sudden supply shocks, simply did not anticipate that his generosity, however well intentioned, could function almost like an economic weapon against the very markets he was patronizing. There is some indication that Musa himself eventually recognized the damage his spending had caused, though accounts differ on exactly how and when this recognition occurred. Some later traditions suggest that on his return journey through Cairo, Musa attempted to borrow gold back from local merchants at high interest rates, specifically to help restore some balance to the market he had disrupted on his way out. Whether this particular detail reflects historical accuracy or later embellishment added to make the story more instructive is difficult to determine with certainty, but the broader pattern it describes fits comfortably within what we know of the overall episode. Beyond the economic disruption, Musa's stay in Cairo accomplished something considerably more valuable to Mali's long term interests than any individual transaction could have. It placed Mali firmly and unmistakably on the mental map of the wider Islamic world's most sophisticated urban centers. Scholars, merchants, and officials who witnessed the visit or heard detailed accounts of it from those who had now possessed first-hand knowledge of Mali's existence, wealth, and religious devotion, replacing generations of vague trading rumors with something closer to verified, eyewitness testimony. This shift mattered enormously for how the wider world would come to understand West Africa in the years and decades following Musa's visit. Cairo functioned as a crossroads for scholars, diplomats, and travelers moving between numerous regions of the Islamic world, meaning information absorbed there tended to spread outward with unusual speed and reach. Musa's visit did not simply impress the people who witnessed it directly. It seeded a body of knowledge and testimony that would eventually work its way into geographical texts, court records, and eventually the cartographic traditions that would immortalize him on maps drawn by people who had never set foot anywhere near West Africa themselves. The gold crash, in this sense, represents something more significant than simply an amusing anecdote about a wealthy visitor overwhelming a foreign market with his generosity. It was the mechanism by which Mali's wealth transformed from abstract rumor into something the wider world could measure, discuss, and eventually record for posterity. Cairo's merchants might have grumbled about inflated prices in the months following Musa's departure, but the story of what caused that inflation would travel far beyond their immediate complaints, carried outward through exactly the kind of scholarly and commercial networks that connected Cairo to the rest of the medieval Islamic world. Musa himself, having disrupted one of the great economies of his era, almost as an unintended side effect of religious devotion and royal pride, continued onward from Cairo toward the true purpose of his journey. Mecca and Medina still awaited him, the actual religious core of a pilgrimage that had, along the way, already accomplished something far larger than its original spiritual intent. What happened next would complete the religious obligation that had set this entire extraordinary journey in motion in the first place, even as Cairo's markets slowly worked to recover from an encounter with more gold than the city had likely ever seen arrive at once. Chapter 9: The Historian Who Remembered Him. Almost everything the wider world would eventually know about Musa's time in Cairo comes filtered through the work of a single man who never actually met him. Shihab al-Din al-Omari was a Damascus-born scholar and administrator working within the Mamluk bureaucratic system, a prolific writer whose interests span geography, history, and the workings of government across the Islamic world. He did not witness Musa's visit to Cairo firsthand. By the time al-Umari arrived in Egypt and began gathering the material that would eventually form his account, roughly 12 years had passed since Musa's caravan had moved through the city. This gap matters enormously for understanding both the value and the limitations of what al-Umari eventually produced. He was not a contemporary eyewitness recording fresh impressions. He was closer to a journalist arriving over a decade late to interview people who remembered a remarkable event from their own past, relying on human memory that had already had years to embellish, compress, or reshape whatever had actually happened during those weeks in 1324. Memory of this kind is rarely perfectly reliable, and al-Umari himself seems to have understood this limitation, even as he worked to compile the most complete account he could manage. What al-Umari actually did was interview Cairenes who had directly witnessed Musa's visit, or who had at least heard detailed accounts from those who had. This method, essentially a form of oral history gathering conducted within living memory of the event itself, produced a text richer and more specific in its details than most contemporary court chronicles managed to achieve. His informants remembered particular moments vividly: the disruption in gold prices, the scale of the retinue, the specific tension around whether Musa would perform the customary prostration before the Sultan. This vividness comes with real trade-offs, however, and modern historians approach al-Umari's account with appropriate caution rather than treating every detail as verified fact. Stories told and retold across 12 years tend to accumulate exaggeration, particularly stories about something as inherently dramatic and memorable as an African king seemingly capable of destabilizing an entire city's economy through sheer generosity. Numbers describing the size of Musa's retinue or the quantity of gold he carried likely grew somewhat in the retelling, as such numbers typically do whenever oral memory rather than contemporary written record preserves them. Despite these limitations, Al-Umari's account remains the single most detailed and important surviving source for understanding Musa's visit to Cairo, and by extension, much of what the wider medieval Islamic world came to believe about Mali itself. His work, compiled within a larger geographical and historical text covering many regions beyond just Egypt and West Africa, preserved details that would otherwise have vanished entirely from the historical record within a generation or two of the actual event. Without his effort to interview surviving witnesses while their memories remained accessible, much of what we now consider common knowledge about Musa's pilgrimage might never have survived at all. Al-Umari's broader body of work extended well past this single episode, reflecting genuine scholarly ambition rather than a narrow fascination with one visiting monarch's spending habits. He compiled information on numerous regions and rulers across the Islamic world and beyond, working within a tradition of geographical and historical writing that valued comprehensive knowledge of distant lands, even lands the author himself would never personally visit. His account of Mali fits within this larger project as one region among many he sought to document, though it happens to be among the sections that survived with the richest and most memorable detail. The specific details Al-Umari preserved about Mali extend beyond just the Cairo visit itself, offering glimpses into how the wider Islamic world understood Mali's governance, religious practice, and economic structure more broadly. He described aspects of the crown's relationship to gold production, distinguishing between nuggets and dust in a way that suggests his informants had genuine, specific knowledge of Mali's economic system rather than vague second-hand rumor. This level of specificity lends credibility to at least the broad outlines of his account, even where individual numbers or dramatic flourishes deserve more skepticism. Al-Umari was not the only medieval writer to document Mali and Musa's pilgrimage, though his account has become the most frequently cited by later historians due to its relative detail and specificity. Other geographers and chroniclers working across the Islamic world touched on Mali in their own writings, some drawing on al-Umari's work directly, others compiling independent information gathered through separate trading and diplomatic contacts. Ibn Khaldun, one of the most significant historians of the medieval Islamic world, referenced Mali and its rulers in his own later writings, adding another layer of corroboration to the broader picture, even where specific details between sources sometimes diverge. This pattern of multiple, partially independent sources describing similar core facts about Musa's wealth and his pilgrimage helps modern historians build reasonable confidence in the broad outline of events, even while individual numbers remain genuinely uncertain. When several separate writers, working from different informants across different decades, converge on a consistent picture of enormous wealth, dramatic economic disruption, and genuine religious devotion, that convergence carries real evidentiary weight. It does not eliminate uncertainty entirely, but it moves the story from unverifiable legend toward reasonably well supported history. It is worth pausing to consider what this entire situation reveals about how history gets recorded and preserved, particularly for regions and rulers outside the immediate reach of contemporary written record keeping traditions. Mali itself, during Musa's era, relied primarily on oral tradition carried by griots, rather than extensive written chronicling of its own history, in the way that, say, Mamluk Egypt maintained detailed court records. This meant that much of what became known about Musa's reign and his pilgrimage survived not because Mali itself wrote it down in detail, but because it happened to intersect dramatically enough with a literate record keeping civilization that someone eventually thought to write it down from the outside. This dynamic created a peculiar asymmetry in how history remembers Musa compared to how it might remember a ruler operating entirely within a written record keeping tradition. We know an enormous amount about a few dramatic weeks of his life spent in Cairo, information preserved almost by accident through al Umari's later scholarly curiosity, while we know comparatively little about decades of his actual governance back in Mali, where the primary historical tradition remained oral rather than written. The historian who remembered him remembered, quite naturally, what struck outside observers as most remarkable, rather than necessarily what mattered most to Musa's own subjects living under his rule at home. Modern historians working to reconstruct Mali's history under Musa must constantly navigate this imbalance, weighing detailed but potentially embellished accounts like Al-Umari's against the comparatively thin documentation of Musa's actual day-to-day governance. Archaeological evidence, oral tradition preserved and eventually recorded by later generations of griots, and cross referencing between multiple written Arabic sources all contribute pieces to a picture that remains, even now, considerably less complete than historians would prefer. Mansa Musa exists in the historical record as a curious combination of vividly documented spectacle and frustratingly undocumented substance. None of this uncertainty diminishes the core, well supported facts at the center of the story. Musa did travel to Mecca with an enormous retinue. He did carry and distribute extraordinary quantities of gold along the way. His visit to Cairo did produce a documented economic disruption significant enough that people were still discussing it in vivid detail more than a decade after it occurred. These core facts survive corroboration across multiple sources and stand on considerably firmer ground than the more specific numbers and colorful details that inevitably accumulated around them through years of retelling. What Omari ultimately handed down to history was not a perfect objective transcript of exactly what happened during Musa's stay in Cairo. It was something both more human and more valuable than that, a careful scholar's honest attempt to preserve the memory of an extraordinary event before the last people who had witnessed it firsthand passed away and took their recollections with them. Thanks largely to his effort, a king who ruled an empire the wider medieval world barely understood managed to leave behind a documented legacy considerably richer than most rulers of his era and region ever achieved, even if that legacy arrived through the imperfect, inevitably human process of memory, interview, and careful scholarly compilation rather than direct contemporary record. Chapter 10: Mecca and Medina. Leaving Cairo behind, Musa's caravan turned toward the true destination of the entire journey, the holy cities that had drawn Muslim pilgrims from across the known world for centuries before he was ever born. The route from Egypt toward the Hejaz followed established pilgrimage paths, well traveled by generations of the faithful, making the same journey from every corner of the Islamic world. Musa's retinue, though considerably diminished in the wake of the gold spent and given away in Cairo, remained an imposing procession by any ordinary standard, even if it no longer carried quite the overwhelming excess it had displayed weeks earlier. The journey from Cairo to Mecca was not without its own considerable hardships, cutting across terrain that shared much of the same unforgiving character as the Sahara crossing already survived. Pilgrims traveling this route for centuries had developed their own accumulated wisdom about timing, water sources, and the particular dangers of this stretch of desert separating Egypt from the Arabian Peninsula. Musa's caravan, having already proven its capacity to manage a far larger and more logistically demanding crossing, moved through this portion of the journey with the benefit of experience gained crossing an even harsher landscape earlier. Arrival in Mecca itself carried a weight that no amount of wealth or spectacle could substitute for or diminish. This was, after all, the actual purpose driving the entire undertaking, the religious core around which every other aspect of the journey, however dramatic, ultimately revolved. The Hajj required specific rites performed in a particular sequence, rituals connecting Musa to a tradition stretching back to the earliest days of Islam and shared by every pilgrim who had ever made this same journey, regardless of where in the world they had traveled from. The rites themselves followed the pattern observed by pilgrims across the Islamic world, largely unchanged in their essential structure since the earliest generations of Muslim practice. Circling the Kaaba 7 times, moving between the hills of Safa and Marwa, standing in prayer at Mount Arafat, these were not customs unique to any particular region or people, but shared obligations binding together a religious community that spanned continents and encompassed extraordinary diversity in language, culture, and political circumstance. Musa performed these rites as one pilgrim among many, his royal status back home carrying no particular weight or exemption within the ritual framework itself. There is something worth sitting with in this leveling quality of the pilgrimage experience. A man who had, weeks earlier, disrupted the economy of one of the greatest cities in the medieval world through the sheer scale of his wealth, now stood shoulder to shoulder with pilgrims of every background, performing identical rites, wearing the same simple pilgrim garments required of all who entered this sacred state, regardless of their wealth or rank back home. Whatever Musa's motivations for the scale and spectacle of his journey, the actual religious core of the Hajj offered no special accommodation for kings. Other pilgrims making the journey that same year would have encountered Musa not as an abstract rumor, but as a living, present figure moving among them through the same rites they themselves were performing. This direct contact mattered considerably for how word of Mali and its ruler continued spreading outward through the wider Islamic world. Pilgrims traveled to Mecca from an enormous geographic range, from Spain and Morocco in the west to Persia and Central Asia in the east, and many of them would carry home their own first-hand accounts of having witnessed or at least heard discussed among fellow pilgrims the remarkable West African king performing Hajj that particular year. Musa's visit to Medina, the city where the Prophet Muhammad is buried, and which forms an important complementary destination alongside Mecca for many pilgrims, added another layer to the religious significance of his journey. Visiting the Prophet's tomb and mosque was not technically a required component of the Hajj itself, but it had become a deeply valued practice among pilgrims, capable of extending their journey to include it. Musa's evident devotion, consistently described across the various surviving accounts of his pilgrimage, makes it entirely unsurprising that he would have made this additional visit part of his overall journey. Scholars and religious teachers in Mecca and Medina represented another important point of contact during Musa's time in the holy cities, one that would carry consequences extending well beyond the pilgrimage itself. Islamic scholarship in this era operated through extensive networks connecting teachers and students across vast distances, and a wealthy, devout ruler visiting the heart of the Islamic world represented an opportunity for exactly the kind of scholarly exchange and recruitment that could benefit his kingdom considerably once he returned home. Musa appears to have used at least part of his time in the holy cities cultivating relationships with scholars and religious figures who might be persuaded to return with him to Mali. This recruitment effort reflected a broader pattern visible throughout Musa's pilgrimage, one in which religious devotion and practical state building interest moved together rather than operating as separate, competing motivations. A pilgrimage undertaken purely for personal spiritual fulfillment might have ended with Musa simply returning home once the required rites were complete. Musa instead appears to have treated his time in the holy cities as an opportunity to strengthen Mali's connections to the wider Islamic intellectual and religious world, laying groundwork for institutions and scholarly communities that would flourish back home in the years following his return. Among the most significant relationships formed during this broader journey, whether in Mecca specifically or during the earlier stop in Cairo, was Musa's connection with a scholar and poet named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, a figure whose eventual journey to Mali would leave a lasting architectural and cultural legacy that outlasted Musa himself by centuries. The exact circumstances of how Musa recruited al-Sahili vary somewhat between different accounts, with some traditions placing the connection in Cairo rather than in the Hijaz itself. What matters more than the precise location of their meeting is the outcome: a skilled and educated man from the heart of the Islamic world agreeing to travel to Mali and contribute his talents to Musa's kingdom. The pilgrimage rites themselves, for all their religious significance, occupied a relatively compressed period within the overall span of Musa's journey, which stretched across roughly 2 years when accounting for the full outbound and return travel alongside the time spent in Cairo, Mecca, and Medina. This proportion matters for understanding the full shape of the undertaking. The specific religious obligation driving the entire journey required only days to complete once Musa actually reached the holy cities, while the surrounding diplomatic, economic, and cultural dimensions of the pilgrimage stretched across a far longer span of time and touched far more people than the rites themselves ever directly involved. Word of Musa's presence in Mecca that year would have reached pilgrims and residents who had no direct connection to Cairo's economic disruption and no first-hand knowledge of the caravan's staggering scale during the desert crossing. For these observers, Musa was known primarily, or perhaps exclusively, through his presence as a fellow pilgrim, performing the same sacred rites they themselves had traveled great distances to complete. This created a somewhat different, more purely religious dimension to how at least some portion of the wider Islamic world came to know of him, separate from the wealth and spectacle that dominated the accounts emerging from Cairo. By the time Musa completed the required rites and prepared to begin his return journey, he had accomplished something considerably larger than the personal spiritual fulfillment that had originally motivated his vow years earlier back in Mali. He had fulfilled a religious obligation central to his faith, formed relationships with scholars capable of enriching his kingdom's intellectual life, and, largely as an unavoidable byproduct of the sheer scale at which he chose to travel, introduced an entire empire to a world that had previously known it only through fragmentary trading rumors passed along secondhand for generations. The return journey now awaiting him carried its own significance, offering an opportunity to consolidate what the outbound leg of the pilgrimage had already accomplished. Musa would pass back through Cairo, where the economic disruption from his earlier visit had not yet fully settled, and he would carry homeward with him not just religious fulfillment, but the beginnings of a cultural and architectural transformation that would reshape how Mali presented itself to the wider world for generations following his return. What happened in the holy cities themselves may have occupied only a brief portion of a 2-year journey, but its consequences would echo through Mali's history for decades after Musa's caravan finally turned south again, back toward the empire that had funded and made possible this entire remarkable undertaking. Chapter 11: The Journey Home and a Scholar's Decision. Turning south from the holy cities, Musa faced a return journey that carried a different character than the outbound leg had. The outbound crossing had been driven by anticipation, by the slow build toward a religious obligation years in the planning, and by a caravan still carrying the bulk of the wealth intended to sustain and announce it along the way. The return journey instead carried a caravan considerably lighter in gold, having spent and given away vast quantities of it in Cairo and beyond, but heavier in something else: relationships, scholarly recruits, and a reputation that now preceded Musa rather than merely following rumor. The route home retraced much of the same path that had carried the caravan north, back across the harsh terrain separating the Hejaz from Egypt, and then once more through Cairo before continuing toward the Sahara crossing that would eventually return Musa to his own territory. This second passage through Cairo offered an opportunity to observe firsthand some of the consequences his earlier visit had left behind. The gold market that had been so dramatically disrupted by his outbound spending had not yet fully recovered, and some accounts suggest Musa took specific steps to address this during his return stay. Among the more frequently repeated details from this second Cairo visit is the claim that Musa borrowed gold from local merchants at unusually high interest rates, an arrangement that seems on its surface like an odd choice for a ruler who had arrived in the city carrying what seemed like inexhaustible wealth only months earlier. The likely explanation lies in simple practical necessity combined with a genuine effort at economic repair. Having given away or spent the vast majority of the gold he carried, Musa needed resources to sustain his retinue through the remainder of the journey home, and borrowing at high rates from merchants eager to recoup value after his earlier disruption may have offered a mutually convenient solution to both problems at once. This detail, whether entirely accurate in its specifics or somewhat embellished through the years of retelling that separated the event from Alumari's eventual written account, reflects something genuinely important about how Musa's visit was remembered by the people who lived through its economic consequences. It was not simply recalled as an act of overwhelming generosity, admired uncritically by everyone who witnessed it. It was remembered, at least by some, as an economic event with real costs attached, consequences serious enough that Musa himself apparently felt some obligation, or at least practical need, to address them before continuing on his way. The more consequential outcome of Musa's time in Cairo, at least for the long term trajectory of Mali's history, involved a decision made regarding a particular scholar and architect whose talents Musa had encountered during his stay. Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, sometimes identified in various sources as hailing originally from Granada in Andalusia, was known within scholarly and cultured circles for both his poetry and his architectural knowledge, skills that had earned him recognition across the parts of the Islamic world he had traveled through before his path crossed with Musa's. Accounts of exactly how and where Musa first encountered al-Sahili vary somewhat, with different traditions placing their initial meeting either in Cairo or possibly during Musa's time in the Hijaz itself. What matters more than resolving this particular ambiguity is understanding what Musa saw in the man that made recruiting him worth the effort. Mali's own architectural traditions, while sophisticated in their own regional context, had developed independently of the stone and brick building techniques common across North Africa and the broader Mediterranean world, techniques that al-Sahili had studied and mastered as part of his own education and travels. Musa appears to have recognized an opportunity in this encounter that extended well beyond simple curiosity about foreign building styles. A ruler who had just spent months demonstrating his kingdom's wealth to some of the most sophisticated cities in the Islamic world now had the chance to bring back something more lasting than memories of spectacle and generosity. Recruiting a skilled architect to accompany him home offered the possibility of translating Mali's wealth into permanent structures, buildings that could stand as physical testimony to the kingdom's sophistication long after the gold itself had been spent or scattered across the markets of Cairo. Persuading Al-Sahili to leave the familiar cosmopolitan world of Cairo and the broader Mediterranean for a journey to a kingdom he likely knew only through Musa's own description and reputation required more than casual invitation. The specific terms of this arrangement, whatever compensation or promises Musa offered to secure his agreement, do not survive in detailed record. What survives instead is the outcome itself. Al-Sahili agreed to make the journey, joining Musa's returning caravan for the long trip back across territory that would have been entirely unfamiliar to a man who had spent his life within the more settled, urban world of North Africa and Andalusia. This decision by al-Sahili to accompany Musa reflects something worth considering about how opportunity and ambition operated even among scholars and craftsmen in this era, not merely among kings and conquerors. A skilled architect working within the crowded, competitive intellectual environment of Cairo might reasonably calculate that traveling to serve as the primary architectural voice for an enormously wealthy and evidently eager patron represented a rare professional opportunity, whatever uncertainties and hardships the actual journey might involve. Mali, for all its distance and unfamiliarity, offered something Cairo's already saturated architectural scene could not: a genuinely blank canvas and an enthusiastic royal patron with seemingly limitless resources to commission new work. The journey back across the Sahara, now traveling in the opposite direction from the crossing described earlier in this account, presented the same fundamental challenges the caravan had already proven capable of managing. Water, heat, and the careful coordination of a still substantial retinue remained constant concerns, even with a caravan considerably reduced from its original outbound size and wealth. Al Sahili, experiencing this crossing for the first time, would have found himself confronting a landscape and set of hardships entirely outside anything his prior travels through the more settled regions of the Mediterranean world had prepared him for. Whatever difficulties this crossing presented, both Musa and his newly recruited scholar architect survived it, arriving eventually back within the more familiar territory of Mali's own empire after a journey that had by this point stretched across roughly 2 years since Musa's initial departure. The empire he returned to had been governed in his absence by the regency arrangement he had established before leaving, a structure that, unlike the situation following Abu Bakr's disappearance decades earlier, had been built from the start with the clear expectation of the ruler's eventual return. Musa's homecoming carried a significance considerably different from his departure years earlier. He had left as a Mansa whose reputation, however substantial within West Africa itself, remained largely unknown to the wider Islamic world beyond scattered trading rumors. He returned as a figure whose name, wealth, and devotion had been personally witnessed, discussed, and increasingly documented by scholars, merchants, and officials across some of the most significant cities in the medieval Islamic world. This transformation in reputation would prove to have consequences reaching considerably beyond Musa's own lifetime. Al Sahili's arrival in Mali marked the beginning of a new chapter in the kingdom's architectural and cultural history, one that would leave physical traces still studied and admired centuries later. The scholar architect brought with him building techniques and stylistic sensibilities drawn from the Andalusian and North African traditions he had studied throughout his career, knowledge that Musa was eager to apply to structures befitting an empire that had just demonstrated its wealth and sophistication so dramatically to the wider world. What Al Sahili would go on to build in the years following his arrival would become inseparable from how history remembers Musa's reign, transforming the city of Timbuktu in ways that would echo for centuries after both men had died. The journey home, then, accomplished considerably more than simply returning Musa safely to the throne he had left in his son's temporary care. It closed the loop on a pilgrimage that had begun as a personal religious vow and had, through a combination of genuine devotion, royal pride, and the simple consequences of scale, become something closer to a diplomatic and cultural transformation for the entire empire. What remained now was the work of translating everything gained along that extraordinary journey into something permanent, built in stone rather than carried in memory or gold, standing in the heart of Mali itself for the wider world to eventually seek out and witness for themselves. Chapter 12: Timbuktu Transformed. Timbuktu, at the time Musa returned from his pilgrimage, was already a functioning trading town rather than a settlement he founded from nothing, contrary to a popular misconception that sometimes attaches itself to this part of the story, situated near the bend of the Niger River, at a point where trans Saharan caravan routes intersected with river based trade moving through the region. The town had developed over preceding generations into a meaningful commercial hub. What Musa's return and Al Sahili's arrival alongside him changed was not the town's existence, but its character and ambition. Mali had absorbed Timbuktu into its territory sometime before Musa's own reign, adding another valuable node to an empire already built around controlling exactly this kind of strategic trading position. Musa recognized in the town something worth investing in beyond its existing commercial function, an opportunity to create a physical symbol of Mali's newly demonstrated wealth and religious sophistication in a location that traders and travelers from across the wider region would inevitably pass through and see for themselves. This calculation, whether made explicitly or arrived at through simple accumulated instinct, shaped much of what followed. The most significant physical undertaking to emerge from this period was the construction of the Jingariber Mosque, a project generally attributed to al Sahili's architectural guidance, combined with Musa's patronage and evident enthusiasm for the undertaking. Built primarily from mud brick using construction techniques adapted to the specific materials and climate of the region, the mosque represented something genuinely new in the architectural landscape of this part of West Africa. It combined structural elements and stylistic sensibilities Al Sahili had carried with him from his training in Andalusia and North Africa, with materials and building methods already familiar to local craftsmen working in the Sahel. This fusion deserves closer attention than a simple description of the building's dimensions might suggest. Al Sahili did not simply transplant North African architectural forms wholesale onto West African soil, ignoring the practical realities of local materials and climate. Mud brick construction, already well established across the Sahel region as a practical response to the scarcity of stone and the abundance of clay-rich soil, required different structural approaches than the stone construction al-Sahili had studied in Andalusia. The resulting mosque reflected genuine adaptation rather than simple imitation, a building that could only have emerged from this particular meeting of traditions. The mosque's construction also reflected the specific religious and cultural priorities driving Musa's broader agenda following his return from pilgrimage. A building of this scale and ambition, built to serve as a center of Islamic worship and study in a region where the faith had previously operated with far less permanent, monumental physical infrastructure, communicated something important about how seriously Musa intended to elevate Islamic practice and scholarship within his empire going forward. This was not a modest addition to existing local religious infrastructure. It was a deliberate statement of intent, built in the most visible and durable materials available. Contemporary and later accounts suggest the construction project moved forward with considerable resources and attention from Musa's court, consistent with the pattern of royal enthusiasm and patronage that had characterized his approach throughout the pilgrimage and its aftermath. Craftsmen, laborers, and materials needed to be organized and coordinated on a scale that matched the ambition of the project itself. This organizational effort mirrored, on a smaller and more localized scale, the same kind of logistical capability Musa's court had already demonstrated in assembling and managing the enormous pilgrimage caravan years earlier. Beyond the mosque itself, al-Sahili's architectural influence appears to have extended into other construction projects during this period, including what some later traditions describe as a royal residence or audience hall built using similar techniques and stylistic principles. The specific details of these additional structures are considerably less well documented than the Djingareyber Mosque, which survived in some form long enough to be studied, described, and eventually restored by later generations. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that al-Sahili's arrival triggered a broader shift in how Mali's court approached monumental architecture, moving toward more permanent, deliberately impressive construction than had characterized the region's building traditions before his arrival. This architectural transformation carried significance extending well beyond aesthetics or even religious symbolism, touching on how the wider Islamic world would come to perceive Mali's level of civilizational sophistication. Monumental religious architecture in the broader Islamic world of this era functioned as a recognized marker of a ruler's piety, wealth, and legitimacy, a visible and durable form of political and religious statement that written accounts or spoken reputation alone could never fully replicate. A kingdom capable of commissioning and completing buildings of this ambition and scale was, by the standards of the era, unmistakably announcing its membership among the more serious and established powers of the Islamic world. The timing of this construction, coming directly on the heels of Musa's dramatic pilgrimage and the reputation it had generated across Cairo, Mecca, and the broader trading networks connecting West Africa to the Mediterranean, was almost certainly not coincidental. Musa appears to have understood that the reputation gained through his pilgrimage needed some form of permanent physical anchor back home, evidence that could greet the merchants, scholars, and travelers who might now be drawn to Mali specifically because of what they had heard about its ruler's wealth and devotion. A mosque built in the latest architectural fashion, incorporating techniques familiar to visitors from across the Islamic world, served exactly this function. Local building traditions did not simply vanish or become subordinate to this new imported influence, however, and it would be a mistake to characterize this period as a wholesale replacement of existing West African architectural knowledge with foreign techniques imposed from outside. Rather, the Djingareyber Mosque and the other structures attributed to this period represent a genuine synthesis, one that drew selectively on al-Sahili's training while remaining fundamentally shaped by the materials, climate, and construction knowledge that local craftsmen brought to the actual physical work of building. This synthesis would go on to influence Sahelian architectural traditions considerably beyond Musa's own reign, establishing patterns and techniques that later builders across the region would continue to draw upon for generations. Timbuktu's transformation during this period extended beyond its physical architecture to encompass its broader function within Mali's empire and the wider trading and intellectual networks connecting West Africa to North Africa and the Mediterranean world. A town that had previously operated primarily as a commercial waypoint began, during and after Musa's reign, to develop a more prominent identity as a center of religious and scholarly activity as well, a shift that would eventually culminate in the reputation Timbuktu would carry for centuries as one of the significant intellectual centers of the Islamic world. This dual identity, combining ongoing commercial importance with a growing reputation for religious scholarship, did not emerge instantly or solely as a result of Musa's specific building projects. It developed gradually, building on the foundation Musa's reign had established, as scholars, students, and religious teachers increasingly found their way to a town that now offered both the commercial opportunities of an established trading hub and the physical and institutional infrastructure to support serious religious study. The mosque Musa commissioned would eventually anchor a broader scholarly ecosystem that grew up around and beyond it in the decades following his death. It is worth remembering, amid all this architectural and cultural transformation, that Musa's motivations likely combined genuine religious devotion with a clear eyed understanding of the practical political value this kind of investment offered his empire. These two motivations are not contradictory, and separating them cleanly may be more a modern analytical impulse than an accurate reflection of how Musa himself would have understood his own choices. A devout ruler who also recognized the diplomatic and reputational value of visible religious architecture was not being insincere in either capacity. He was simply operating as most successful rulers of any era tend to, with multiple compatible motivations reinforcing rather than undermining one another. By the time construction on these major projects had substantially progressed, Timbuktu had begun a transformation that would continue accelerating in the years following Musa's own death, eventually establishing the town's reputation as far more than simply a valuable trading post along established caravan routes. The physical structures Musa and al-Sahili built together represented only the beginning of this longer process, a foundation upon which later generations of scholars, builders, and rulers would continue to build. What started as one king's effort to translate the reputation gained through an extraordinary pilgrimage into something permanent back home would eventually grow into something considerably larger than even Musa himself likely anticipated when construction on the Jingariber Mosque first began. Chapter 13: A City of Scholars. The scholarly reputation Timbuktu would eventually carry across centuries did not spring fully formed from Musa's building projects alone, though those projects provided essential foundation for everything that followed. What grew in Timbuktu during and after Musa's reign was closer to an ecosystem than a single institution, a gradually accumulating network of teachers, students, manuscripts, and religious institutions that fed off one another in ways that took generations to reach the reputation the town would eventually hold. Understanding this growth requires looking past the mosque itself toward the intellectual culture that grew up around it. Central to this development was the institution that would become known as Sankor, associated with a mosque of the same name that predates Musa's own building projects, but expanded considerably in scholarly significance during and after his reign. Sankor functioned less like a single formal university in the modern sense, and more like a loose confederation of independent scholars, each teaching within their own area of expertise, students moving between different teachers to acquire the specific instruction they sought. This structure, common across many centers of Islamic learning in this era, allowed for considerable flexibility in how education actually proceeded within the town. Subjects taught within this scholarly environment extended well beyond religious instruction narrowly defined, though Quranic study, Islamic law, and theology formed an important core of the curriculum available to students. Grammar, rhetoric, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine all found their place within Timbuktu's growing intellectual life, reflecting the broader tradition of Islamic scholarship that treated religious and secular knowledge as complementary rather than entirely separate pursuits. Students who traveled to Timbuktu for education could expect exposure to a genuinely broad intellectual tradition, not a narrowly religious one. Musa's patronage played a meaningful role in creating conditions that allowed this scholarly culture to flourish more fully than it might have otherwise. Scholars require more than simply the freedom to teach. They require physical infrastructure, financial support, and a political environment stable and prosperous enough to sustain intellectual life without the constant disruption that instability or poverty tends to bring. Mali under Musa's rule offered exactly this kind of stable, wealthy foundation, and the scholars and teachers who had begun gathering in Timbuktu benefited directly from the security and resources his reign provided. The relationships Musa cultivated during his pilgrimage, particularly the scholars and religious figures he encountered and sometimes recruited during his time in Cairo and the Hejaz, likely contributed additional intellectual resources to this growing environment. A ruler returning from such an extended and well documented journey through the heart of the Islamic world's major religious and intellectual centers brought back more than architectural inspiration and a single recruited architect. He brought back connections, reputation, and quite possibly additional scholars persuaded to make the considerable journey to a kingdom whose ruler had just demonstrated both extraordinary wealth and genuine religious seriousness on the world stage. Manuscript culture formed another crucial pillar of Timbuktu's developing scholarly reputation, one whose full significance would become fully apparent only centuries after Musa's own death, when later travelers and eventually modern scholars began cataloging the sheer volume of written material the town's scholarly community had produced and preserved over generations. Books were valuable commodities in this era, painstakingly copied by hand, and a town developing a genuine reputation for scholarship naturally became a place where such manuscripts accumulated, were studied, copied, and passed down through successive generations of teachers and students. The economics of manuscript production and trade intersected meaningfully with Timbuktu's existing commercial function as a trading hub, creating another layer of activity beyond the caravan trade in gold and salt that had originally established the town's importance. Manuscripts, like other valuable goods, moved along trade networks, and a town positioned at the intersection of trans Saharan and river based trade routes was well situated to become a center where books, along with the scholars who studied and produced them, naturally accumulated over time. This commercial infrastructure, already well established before Musa's reign, provided practical support for the intellectual culture developing alongside it. It would be a mistake to imagine this scholarly flowering as something that reached its full celebrated form during Musa's own lifetime. What Musa's reign provided was foundation and momentum rather than a finished achievement. The Timbuktu that later travelers like Leo Africanus would describe in glowing terms, and the manuscript collections that modern scholars have worked to preserve and catalog in more recent centuries, represent the accumulated product of generations of continued growth, building on what Musa's era had established, not something that sprang into existence complete during his own reign. This distinction matters for accurately understanding Musa's actual historical contribution to Timbuktu's intellectual legacy. He did not personally found Sankor, and he did not personally write or commission the bulk of the manuscripts that would eventually make the town famous among later historians of African intellectual history. What he did accomplish was creating conditions, through political stability, architectural investment, and the reputation and connections gained through his pilgrimage that allowed an already developing scholarly culture to accelerate and expand considerably during and after his reign. The relationship between commerce and scholarship in Timbuktu during this period deserves particular attention, since it illustrates something important about how intellectual centers actually develop and sustain themselves in the medieval world, rather than existing as isolated communities of pure learning detached from economic reality. Wealthy merchants engaged in the gold and salt trade often served as patrons for scholars and religious institutions, a pattern common across the Islamic world in this era, where commercial wealth and religious or intellectual patronage frequently reinforced one another rather than operating in separate spheres. Timbuktu's scholarly community depended on this ongoing commercial prosperity as much as it depended on any specific royal patronage from Musa's court. Students drawn to Timbuktu during this period of growth came from across a considerable geographic range within West Africa and, increasingly, from further afield as the town's reputation spread. This educational migration mirrored, on a smaller and more specialized scale, the same kind of movement that characterized major centers of Islamic learning across North Africa and the Middle East, where reputation for scholarly excellence in particular subjects drew students willing to travel considerable distances for access to specific teachers and institutions. Timbuktu was, by the later years of Musa's reign and the decades following it, beginning to occupy a genuine place within this broader network of Islamic scholarly movement and exchange. The specific scholarly disciplines that flourished most prominently in Timbuktu reflected both the broader priorities of Islamic education generally and the particular needs of a trading society deeply embedded in commercial and legal relationships spanning considerable distances. Islamic law, in particular, held obvious practical value for a society whose economic life depended heavily on contracts, trade agreements, and the resolution of disputes between merchants operating across long distance networks. Scholars trained in jurisprudence served practical functions within Timbuktu's commercial life that extended well beyond purely religious or academic considerations. This intersection between practical commercial need and scholarly religious tradition helps explain why Timbuktu's intellectual culture proved durable enough to survive and grow across centuries, long after Musa's own reign had ended and control of the broader region had passed through various subsequent political transitions. Scholarly institutions dependent purely on royal patronage tend to wither once that specific patron's support ends or political circumstances shift. Timbuktu's scholarly community, by contrast, remained embedded within an ongoing commercial and legal infrastructure that continued generating demand for exactly the kind of education the town's teachers provided, regardless of which particular political power happened to control the region at any given moment. By the time Musa's own reign drew toward its close, Timbuktu had been set firmly on a trajectory that would eventually make it one of the genuinely significant intellectual centers of the medieval Islamic world, a reputation that would persist and grow for centuries after his death, long after most of the specific political and economic circumstances of his own reign had faded from immediate relevance. The mosque he built still stood. The scholars his stability and patronage had helped attract continued teaching and expanding the town's intellectual traditions, and the manuscript culture taking root during this period would eventually accumulate into one of the most significant collections of written knowledge that sub Saharan Africa would produce in the medieval era. Musa's pilgrimage had made him famous across a wider world than he had known before. What grew afterward in Timbuktu would ensure that his kingdom's contribution to that world outlasted the memory of any single journey, however extraordinary that journey had been. Chapter 14: Governing an Empire on the Map. By the years following his return from pilgrimage, Musa governed an empire whose relationship to the wider world had fundamentally changed from what he had inherited decades earlier. Mali was no longer a distant, half-rumored source of gold known primarily through the second-hand accounts of North African traders. It was now a recognized power with a documented ruler, diplomatic contacts stretching from Cairo to Mecca, and a reputation for wealth that had already begun working its way into the geographical and cartographic knowledge of the wider Mediterranean world. Governing this newly visible empire required different considerations than governing the comparatively obscure kingdom Musa had first secured control over. One of the clearest illustrations of just how far this new visibility extended comes from a document created more than a decade after Musa's pilgrimage, far from Mali itself, in a Mediterranean workshop specializing in nautical charts and maps. The Catalan Atlas, produced around 1339 on the island of Majorca by Jewish cartographer Abraham Kreske and his workshop, represented one of the most sophisticated and accurate mapping efforts of its era, compiling geographical knowledge drawn from merchants, travelers, and earlier textual sources describing regions across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Within this atlas, in the section depicting West Africa, appears a seated figure holding a large piece of gold, accompanied by text identifying him as the ruler of the region and describing him in terms that emphasize his extraordinary wealth. This figure is generally understood by historians to represent Mansa Musa, rendered by an artist who had never traveled anywhere near West Africa and who was working entirely from second-hand reports that had traveled through trading and scholarly networks in the years since Musa's pilgrimage. The image is small, occupying only a modest portion of the overall map, yet it would eventually become one of the most reproduced and recognized visual representations of medieval African wealth and power in the modern historical imagination. This single illustration deserves careful consideration because it illustrates something important about how reputation and historical memory actually travel across distance and time. Cresques in his workshop did not know Musa personally, had never visited Mali, and were working from information that had already passed through multiple layers of retelling by merchants, travelers, and scholars before it reached Majorca. What they produced was not a portrait in any literal sense, but a symbolic representation, an artistic shorthand meant to convey the general reputation that had accumulated around this particular ruler and the wealth associated with his kingdom. The fact that this reputation had traveled far enough and with sufficient specificity to warrant inclusion in one of the most sophisticated cartographic projects of the era speaks to just how thoroughly Musa's pilgrimage had succeeded in placing Mali on the mental map of the wider medieval world. Trading rumors about a wealthy kingdom somewhere south of the Sahara had existed for generations before Musa's reign. What his pilgrimage accomplished was transforming those vague rumors into something specific enough and memorable enough to be worth depicting by name in a map intended for serious geographical and commercial reference rather than mere entertainment or speculation. Diplomatic contact with other Islamic powers continued and likely deepened during the years following Musa's return from pilgrimage, building on the relationships and reputation established during his journey through Cairo and the Hejaz. Morocco, under the Marinid dynasty during this period, maintained trading and likely diplomatic relationships with Mali that would have been reinforced by the reputation Musa's pilgrimage had generated. These relationships mattered considerably for Mali's continued access to North African markets and the broader trans-Mediterranean trade networks that connected West African gold to the economies of Europe and the wider Islamic world. Egypt, too, likely maintained some continued diplomatic and commercial contact with Mali following Musa's visit, given the considerable impression his stay had made on Cairo's own court and merchant community. A relationship established through such a dramatic and memorable royal visit does not necessarily translate into ongoing formal diplomatic exchange in the way modern readers might assume, given the considerable distances and logistical challenges involved in maintaining regular contact between Cairo and Mali's own capital. What likely persisted instead was a general awareness and goodwill, reinforced periodically through the ordinary channels of trans-Saharan trade rather than through frequent formal diplomatic missions. This new visibility on the world stage brought benefits to Mali's economic position that extended beyond simple prestige or reputation. Merchants and traders across North Africa, now possessing more specific and reliable knowledge about Mali's wealth and stability, may have found additional incentive to engage in trade with the kingdom, confident that dealing with such a clearly wealthy and evidently well-governed state carried less risk than trading with more obscure or uncertain territories further south. Reputation, in commercial terms, functions as a kind of currency in its own right, reducing the uncertainty that traders must otherwise account for when dealing with unfamiliar or poorly understood trading partners. Musa's own approach to governance during these later years of his reign appears to have built directly on the patterns established earlier, continuing the careful management of provincial governors, trade route security, and the delicate balance between centralized authority and regional autonomy that had characterized his consolidation of power decades earlier. The pilgrimage and its aftermath had not fundamentally altered the basic structure of how Mali's empire actually functioned day to day. It had instead added a new dimension of external reputation and diplomatic connection, layered on top of the same underlying administrative and economic system that had made the empire wealthy and stable in the first place. Religious institutions continued to expand and deepen their role within Mali's governance during this period as well, building on the foundation established through Musa's building projects and the scholars he had helped attract to Timbuktu and other centers of Islamic learning within the empire. Islamic law and religious scholarship increasingly provided a framework that Mali's governing elite could draw upon in managing commercial disputes, administrative questions, and the broader challenge of governing a religiously and culturally diverse population spread across an enormous territory. This growing institutional sophistication reflected the accumulated benefits of decades of gradual Islamic integration within Mali's ruling structures, accelerated considerably by Musa's own pilgrimage and its aftermath. The wider world's growing awareness of Mali did not mean that outside powers suddenly possessed detailed or accurate knowledge of how the empire actually functioned internally. The Catalan Atlas itself, for all its sophistication as a geographical document, still relied on considerable simplification and symbolic shorthand in depicting a kingdom that its creators had never directly observed. Mali remained, even at the height of its reputation following Musa's pilgrimage, a place understood by outsiders primarily through its most dramatic and memorable characteristics, its wealth. Its rulers demonstrated piety, rather than through any deep or nuanced understanding of its actual administrative structures or the diversity of peoples and traditions it actually governed. This gap between external reputation and internal reality is worth remembering as this account continues, since it shapes considerably how modern historians must approach reconstructing Mali's actual history during this period. The image of Musa holding gold in the Catalan Atlas tells us a great deal about how the wider Mediterranean world perceived Mali's wealth. It tells us comparatively little about the actual daily mechanics of governing an empire this size, the ongoing negotiations with provincial governors, the practical management of trade routes, or the countless unglamorous administrative decisions that any functioning state of this scale required on a continuous basis. Decisions that rarely made their way into the kind of dramatic accounts that eventually reached cartographers and chroniclers working thousands of miles away. Musa's later years as Mansa, then, present historians with a familiar pattern already established earlier in his reign, an abundance of information about his external reputation and diplomatic significance, layered over a comparatively thin record of the actual internal governance that sustained his empire day to day. The map that eventually depicted him holding gold captures something true and important about how the wider world understood Mali during this period. It captures considerably less about the actual texture of governing the empire that produced that gold in the first place, work that continued steadily and largely undocumented even as Musa's external reputation reached its peak across the wider medieval world. As Musa's reign entered its final years, this dual legacy, an empire increasingly visible and celebrated abroad, governed through the same patient, unglamorous administrative work that had always sustained it internally, would soon face its most significant test, the question of succession, and whether the stability Musa had built could survive the transition to whoever would inherit the throne after him. Chapter 15: The Last Years and Succession. The precise details of Musa's final years on the throne are considerably less well documented than the dramatic events surrounding his pilgrimage, a pattern consistent with the broader imbalance already noted in how history preserved information about his reign, where the pilgrimage generated detailed accounts from multiple sources across Cairo, Mecca, and the wider Islamic world. The ordinary administration of his later years left comparatively little trace in the surviving historical record. This does not mean these years were uneventful, only that they lacked the kind of dramatic, cross-cultural spectacle that tended to attract the attention of the literate chroniclers whose records happened to survive. What can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence suggests that Musa continued governing according to the same patterns established earlier in his reign, maintaining the delicate balance between centralized authority and provincial autonomy that had allowed Mali to function as a stable, wealthy empire across such an enormous and diverse territory. The reputation gained through his pilgrimage likely continued generating diplomatic and commercial benefits throughout these years, reinforcing Mali's position within the broader trans-Saharan trading networks that remained the foundation of its economic strength. Religious and scholarly institutions in Timbuktu and elsewhere continued developing along the trajectory established during and immediately after his pilgrimage. The question of exactly when Musa died has generated some genuine scholarly disagreement, reflecting the broader difficulty of establishing precise dates for events in Mali's history during this period. Most historians place his death somewhere around 1337, based on cross-referencing available Arabic sources and the approximate chronology that can be established from surrounding events, though some estimates range slightly earlier or later depending on which sources and interpretive methods a particular historian favors. This uncertainty is not unusual for a period and region where written record keeping remained less systematic than in more extensively documented parts of the medieval world. What survives with greater confidence than the exact date is the basic outline of what followed his death. Succession passed to his son, generally identified in the surviving sources as Magan, who had earlier served as regent during Musa's extended absence on pilgrimage. This detail carries a certain resonance worth pausing on, given how the story of Musa's own rise to power had unfolded decades earlier. Where Musa himself had come to power through the accidental circumstances of his predecessor's disappearance at sea, his own succession followed a far more conventional and orderly pattern, passing directly from father to son without the uncertainty that had characterized his own path to the throne. This orderly transition reflects, at least in part, the deliberate planning Musa had put into the question of succession before ever departing on his pilgrimage years earlier. Having personally experienced the uncertainty and improvisation required when a ruler's fate became genuinely unknown, Musa appears to have taken care to ensure his own eventual departure from the throne, whether through death or any other circumstance, would not create the same kind of destabilizing uncertainty that had followed Abu Bakr's disappearance. Establishing Magan as regent during the pilgrimage itself, and presumably continuing to prepare him for eventual succession throughout the remaining years of his reign, represented a lesson learned and deliberately applied. Mansa Musa's own reign, unfortunately for the stability Musa had worked to establish, proved considerably less capable and less lasting than his father's had been. Historical sources describing this period suggest that Magan struggled to maintain the same level of control over the empire's provinces and trade networks that his father had achieved through decades of careful, patient management. The specific details of what went wrong during Magan's rule remain frustratingly sparse in the surviving record, but the general pattern that emerges suggests a ruler who inherited an enormously complex empire without necessarily possessing the same accumulated experience, patience, or political skill that had allowed his father to hold it together so effectively. This pattern, a highly capable founder or consolidator, followed by a less effective successor, is hardly unique to Mali's history, appearing repeatedly across empires and dynasties throughout world history in every region and era. Building and holding together a large, diverse empire requires a particular combination of political skill, patience, and accumulated experience that does not automatically transfer from one generation to the next simply through hereditary succession. Musa had spent decades learning how to manage Mali's provincial governors, its trade routes, and its delicate internal balance of power before his pilgrimage even began. Magan inherited the position without necessarily inheriting the same depth of practical experience. The empire Magan inherited was, by any measure, an enormously complex undertaking to govern successfully, spanning a vast territory with numerous distinct peoples, economic interests, and local power structures, all requiring careful, ongoing management to hold together. Even a highly capable ruler would have faced genuine challenges maintaining Mali's stability at the scale Musa had built it to. A less capable or less experienced ruler, stepping into this role without the decades of gradual preparation his father had benefited from, faced an even steeper challenge, one that the surviving historical record suggests he did not fully manage to overcome. Some sources indicate that certain provinces or tributary territories began asserting greater independence during Magan's reign, testing the boundaries of central authority in ways that had been more effectively contained during his father's time on the throne. This kind of gradual provincial assertion of independence represents a common pattern in the decline of large medieval empires generally, occurring incrementally rather than through any single dramatic rupture. A governor here withholding tribute, a trade route there falling under less direct central oversight, small individual instances accumulating gradually into a broader pattern of weakening imperial cohesion. Magan's reign proved relatively brief, and succession passed afterward to another member of the Kita line, generally identified as Suleiman, who ruled for a considerably longer period and by most accounts managed to restore at least some of the stability and effective governance that had characterized Musa's own reign. Suleiman's rule receives its own attention in surviving Arabic sources, including some direct observation from travelers who visited Mali during his reign, offering a somewhat clearer picture of the empire's condition during this period than the more sparsely documented years of Magan's brief tenure. This partial recovery under Suleiman suggests that Mali's underlying institutional strength, built up carefully over generations before Musa's reign and reinforced considerably during it, retained enough resilience to survive one weaker successor without immediately collapsing. This pattern of strength, weakness, and partial recovery across successive reigns reflects something important about how empires like Mali actually functioned in practice, rather than existing as simple static structures that either held together perfectly or collapsed entirely based on any single ruler's individual competence. The institutions Sundiata had established generations earlier, reinforced and expanded through Musa's own decades of careful governance, provided enough underlying structural strength that the empire could absorb a less effective ruler like Magan without immediately disintegrating. This resilience, built up over generations rather than depending entirely on any single individual's ongoing competence, represents one of the more significant, if less dramatic, achievements of Musa's own reign. Musa's death itself, whenever precisely it occurred, marked the end of what most historians consider the peak period of Mali's power, wealth, and international reputation. The empire would continue functioning for generations afterward, experiencing periods of relative strength and weakness under various successors, but it would never again reach quite the same combination of internal stability, economic prosperity, and international visibility that had characterized Musa's own reign at its height. This does not mean Mali's subsequent history was one of simple, uninterrupted decline, since the empire proved considerably more durable than that simplified narrative would suggest. It does mean that Musa's reign represented something genuinely exceptional, a particular convergence of circumstances and individual capability that his successors, for all their own efforts, generally struggled to fully replicate. The question of how to properly evaluate Musa's reign in comparison to what followed deserves careful consideration rather than simple, uncomplicated praise. His pilgrimage, however dramatic and consequential for Mali's international reputation, represented an enormous expenditure of resources that some later analysis suggests may have strained the empire's finances more than contemporary celebratory accounts typically acknowledge. The architectural and scholarly investments in Timbuktu, while genuinely significant for the empire's long term cultural legacy, also required substantial resources that a less wealthy or less stable ruler might not have been able to afford without risking the kind of destabilization that weaker successors like Magan would eventually struggle against regardless. None of this complexity diminishes what Musa actually accomplished during his decades on the throne, but it does suggest that evaluating his reign requires holding multiple truths simultaneously, rather than settling for a single simplified narrative of unambiguous triumph. He inherited an empire secured through unusual and uncertain circumstances, and he left behind one that was, by most measures, wealthier, more internationally recognized, and more religiously and culturally sophisticated than the one he had inherited decades earlier. He also left behind challenges of succession and institutional sustainability that his immediate successors would need to navigate, with mixed results in the years and decades following his death. What endured beyond these immediate political struggles, and what would ultimately shape how the wider world remembered him centuries later, is the subject that deserves this account's final attention. Chapter 16: What Outlasted Him. Empires rarely end with a single dramatic collapse, and Mali's story after Musa's death illustrates this pattern clearly across the generations that followed. Suleiman's reign, following the brief and less successful tenure of Magan, restored a measure of the stability and effective governance that had characterized Musa's own decades on the throne. The Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta visited Mali during Suleiman's reign, leaving behind an account that offers modern historians one of the clearest direct glimpses available into the empire's functioning during the years following Musa's death. Ibn Battuta's observations, recorded during his travels through Mali in the early 1350s, describe a court still marked by considerable ceremony, wealth, and organizational sophistication, even if his account also includes some critical observations about specific customs and practices he found unfamiliar or objectionable by his own North African standards. His writing provides valuable corroboration for the broader picture of Mali as a genuinely functioning, sophisticated state, rather than simply a source of gold rumored about by distant traders. This account, produced by someone who actually traveled through the empire and observed its workings directly, carries a different kind of evidentiary weight than the second-hand accounts gathered by writers like Al-Umari. Beyond Suleiman's reign, Mali's subsequent history involved a gradual, uneven process of both continued strength and eventual weakening, playing out across more than a century following Musa's death. Various successors held the throne with varying degrees of competence, some managing to maintain much of the empire's territorial extent and economic function, others presiding over periods of provincial rebellion, succession disputes, and gradual loss of control over more distant territories. This pattern of uneven decline, punctuated by periods of partial recovery, characterizes the history of most large medieval empires eventually, and Mali proved no exception to this broader historical tendency. External pressures compounded these internal challenges as the 14th century gave way to the 15th. The rise of the Songhai Empire to Mali's east represented perhaps the most significant long term threat to Mali's continued dominance over the trans Saharan trade routes that had originally built its wealth and power. Songhai, centered around the city of Gao, gradually expanded its own territory and influence during this period, eventually eclipsing Mali as the dominant power controlling trade across this portion of West Africa by the latter part of the 15th century. This transition from Mali to Songhai dominance did not happen suddenly or completely erase Mali's continued existence as a political entity. Mali persisted in some diminished form for generations after losing its position as the region's preeminent power, controlling a smaller territory and wielding considerably less influence over the broader trans Saharan trading networks than it had during Musa's own reign. The empire that Musa had governed at its height gradually contracted, ceding territory and influence to rising powers in a process that unfolded across decades rather than through any single decisive military or political rupture. Timbuktu itself, remarkably, continued flourishing as a center of trade and scholarship, even as political control over the broader region shifted from Mali to Songhai and eventually to other powers in subsequent centuries. The scholarly and commercial infrastructure that had developed during and after Musa's reign proved durable enough to survive these political transitions, a testament to how thoroughly embedded these institutions had become within the town's own economic and cultural life, independent of whichever specific dynasty happened to claim political authority over the broader region at any given moment. While Mali's political power gradually receded from its peak under Musa, the memory and reputation of his pilgrimage followed an almost opposite trajectory, growing rather than fading as the story continued circulating through the geographical and historical writings that preserved it across subsequent generations. El-Umari's account, compiled within a decade of Musa's visit to Cairo, continued being copied, referenced, and incorporated into later geographical and historical texts produced by subsequent generations of Islamic scholars. Each retelling carried the story further from its original source, sometimes preserving details with reasonable accuracy, sometimes allowing numbers and specifics to grow somewhat more dramatic with each successive iteration. The Catalan Atlas, produced in 1339, represents merely the most visually striking example of how Musa's reputation had permeated the wider medieval world's geographical imagination by the time of its creation. Similar references to Mali's wealth and Musa's pilgrimage appear scattered across various other geographical and historical texts produced in subsequent centuries, each drawing on some combination of earlier written sources and whatever additional trading or travel information happened to reach their authors. This accumulated body of reference, however fragmentary and inconsistent in its specific details, kept Musa's story alive within scholarly and geographical circles across the Islamic world and, gradually, within European geographical knowledge as well. European awareness of Musa and Mali developed more slowly and unevenly than awareness within the Islamic world, filtering through indirectly via Arabic geographical sources, occasional direct trading contact along North African coastal routes, and cartographic works like the Catalan Atlas that drew on Mediterranean trading networks connecting Christian and Islamic commercial worlds. This slower, more indirect transmission meant that detailed knowledge of Musa's actual reign and pilgrimage remained considerably less complete in European sources for centuries than the more direct, richly detailed accounts preserved within Arabic scholarly traditions. What European geographical knowledge did absorb tended to emphasize the same core element that had struck observers in Cairo centuries earlier: the seemingly incomprehensible scale of Musa's wealth. This particular emphasis on wealth above all other aspects of Musa's reign and legacy would prove remarkably persistent across the centuries, separating his actual lifetime from the modern era. Later popular retellings, particularly those emerging in more recent decades as Musa's story reached broader audiences through popular history writing and media coverage, have often centered almost entirely on rankings and comparisons of his wealth relative to other historical figures, sometimes describing him in terms suggesting he possessed the greatest fortune of any individual in recorded history. These claims, while capturing something genuinely important about the scale of disruption his spending caused in Cairo, necessarily involve considerable speculation and estimation, given how difficult it remains to precisely quantify wealth accumulated and organized according to economic systems so different from modern financial structures. This modern fascination with quantifying and ranking Musa's wealth, while understandable given how genuinely extraordinary the underlying historical account actually is, risks obscuring other aspects of his reign and legacy that deserve equal attention from anyone genuinely interested in understanding his historical significance. His careful, patient work consolidating and governing a genuinely complex, diverse empire across decades receives far less popular attention than the more dramatic story of his Cairo spending spree. His role in supporting the scholarly and architectural transformation of Timbuktu, work whose consequences would echo for centuries after his death, similarly receives less popular attention than the simpler, more easily summarized narrative about gold and wealth. There is something worth considering in how this particular emphasis came to dominate popular memory of Musa, tracing back through that same chain of transmission, running from Al-Amari's original interviews with Cairo's residents, through subsequent generations of geographical and historical writing, eventually reaching the cartographer working in Majorca, who chose to depict Musa holding a lump of gold rather than, say, presiding over a court of scholars or overseeing the construction of a mosque. That single artistic choice, made by a mapmaker who had never met Musa and was working entirely from secondhand report, would eventually become one of the most reproduced and recognized images associated with medieval African history, shaping popular imagination in ways its original creator could never have anticipated. This is, in its own way, a fitting illustration of how historical memory actually functions across centuries, favoring the vivid, easily communicated detail over the more complex, harder to summarize reality of an actual human life and reign. Musa was, by any reasonable historical assessment, considerably more than simply an extraordinarily wealthy king who happened to disrupt Cairo's gold market during one memorable pilgrimage. He was a ruler who inherited an empire through unusual circumstances and spent decades carefully consolidating and governing it. A genuinely devout man whose religious convictions shaped meaningful institutional investments that outlasted his own reign by centuries, and a figure whose reputation, however imperfectly and selectively remembered, succeeded in placing an entire civilization onto the geographical and historical consciousness of a wider world that had previously known almost nothing of its existence. What remains today, centuries after Musa's death and the gradual decline of the empire he once governed, is a story preserved through an unlikely combination of oral tradition, secondhand scholarly interview, cartographic imagination, and the accumulated retelling of generations who each carried the account a little further from its original source, while adding their own emphases and embellishments along the way. The mosque he built still stands in some form in Timbuktu, weathered by centuries but never entirely lost. The scholarly tradition he helped nurture left behind manuscripts that modern historians continue studying and preserving, and somewhere in a Mediterranean archive, a small illustration on a 14th century map continues showing a seated king holding gold, a single artist's imagining of a man whose actual life and reign proved, in the end, considerably richer and more consequential than even that striking image alone could ever fully convey.